Chapter 98, Part 2 of The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 2, by Tobias Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 98, Part 2. This his intention being made known to the governor and his friends, their countenances immediately cleared up, their courtesy and complaisance returned, and they even furnished him with letters for Geneva, Lausanne, Berne, and Soleure, in consequence of which he met with unusual civilities at these places, having made this tour with his Scotch friend, who came up to him before he left Lyons, and visited the most considerable towns on both sides of the Rhine, and the courts of the Electors Palatine, Mentz, and Cologne. He arrived in Holland, and from thence, through the Netherlands, repaired to London, where he found my lord just returned from Paris. His lordship received him with expressions of uncommon joy, would not suffer him to stir from him for several days, and introduced him to his relations. M. accompanied his lordship from London to his country seat, where he was indeed treated with great friendship and confidence, and consulted in everything. But the noble peer never once made mention of the annuity which he had promised to settle upon him, nor did M. remind him of it, because he conceived it was his affair to fulfill his engagements of his own accord. M. being tired of the manner of living at this place, made an excursion to Bath, where he stayed about a fortnight to partake of the diversions, and upon his return found his lordship making dispositions for another journey to Paris. Surprised at this sudden resolution, he endeavoured to dissuade him from it, but his remonstrances were rendered ineffectual by the insinuations of a foreigner who had come over with him, and filled his imagination with extravagant notions of pleasure infinitely superior to any which he could enjoy while he was in the trammels and under the restraints of a governor. He therefore turned a deaf ear to all M.'s arguments, and entreated him to accompany him in the journey. But this gentleman, foreseeing that a young man like my lord, of strong passions and easy to be misled, would in all probability squander away great sums of money in a way that would neither do credit to himself or to those who were concerned with him, resisted all his solicitations on pretence of having business of consequence at London, and afterwards had reason to be extremely well pleased with his own conduct in this particular. Before he set out on this expedition, M., in justice to himself, reminded him of the proposal which he had made to him at Marseilles, desiring to know if he had altered his design in that particular, in which case he would turn his thoughts some other way, as he would not in the least be thought to intrude or pin himself upon any man. My lord protested in the most solemn manner that he still continued in his former resolution, and again beseeching him to bear him company into France, promised that everything should be settled to his satisfaction upon their return to England. M., however, still persisted in his refusal for the above-mentioned reasons, and though he never heard more of the annuity, he nevertheless continued to serve his lordship with his advice and good offices ever after, particularly in directing his choice to an alliance with a lady of eminent virtue, the daughter of a noble lord, more conspicuous for his shining parts than the splendour of his titles, a circumstance upon which he always reflected with particular satisfaction, as well on account of the extraordinary merit of the lady, as because it vested in her children a considerable part of that great estate which of right belonged to her grandmother, and afterwards put him in a way to retrieve his estate from a heavy load of debt he had contracted. When my lord set out on his Paris expedition, the money M. had received from his generous friend at Paris was almost reduced to the last guinea. He had not yet reaped the least benefit from his engagements with his lordship, and disdaining to ask for a supply from him, he knew not how to subsist with any degree of credit till his return. This uncomfortable prospect was the more disagreeable to him, as at that time of life he was much inclined to appear in the gay world, and had contracted a taste for plays, operas, and other public diversions, and acquired an acquaintance with many people of good fashion, which could not be maintained without a considerable expense. In this emergency he thought he could not employ his idle time more profitably than in translating from foreign languages such books as were then chiefly in vogue, and upon application to a friend who was a man of letters he was furnished with as much business of that kind as he could possibly manage, and wrote some pamphlets on the reigning controversies of that time that had the good fortune to please. He was also concerned in a monthly journal of literature, and the work was carried on by the two friends jointly, though M. did not at all appear in the partnership. By these means he not only spent his mornings in useful exercise, but supplied himself with money for what the French call the menu plaisir during the whole summer. He frequented all the assemblies in and about London, and considerably enlarged his acquaintance among the fair sex. He had, upon his first arrival in England, become acquainted with a lady at an assembly not far from London, and though at that time he had no thoughts of extending his views farther than the usual gallantry of the place, he met with such distinguishing marks of her regard in the sequel, and was so particularly encouraged by the advice of another lady with whom he had been intimate in France, and who was now of their parties, that he could not help entertaining hopes of making an impression upon the heart of his agreeable partner, who was a young lady of an ample fortune and great expectations. He therefore cultivated her good graces with all the assiduity and address of which he was master, and succeeded so well in his endeavours, that after a due course of attendance and the death of an aunt, by which she received an accession of fortune to the amount of £23,000, he ventured to declare his passion, and she not only heard him with patience and approbation, but also replied in terms adequate to his warmest wish. Finding himself so favourably received, he pressed her to secure his happiness by marriage, but to this proposal she objected the recency of her kinswoman's death, which would have rendered such a step highly indecent, and the displeasure of her other relations, from whom she had still greater expectations, and who at that time importuned her to marry a cousin of her own, whom she could not like. However, that M. might have no cause to repine at her delay, she freely entered with him into an intimacy of correspondence, during which nothing could have added to their mutual felicity, which was the more poignant and refined from the mysterious and romantic manner of their enjoying it. For though he publicly visited her as an acquaintance, his behaviour on these occasions was always so distant, respectful, and reserved, that the rest of the company could not possibly suspect the nature of their reciprocal attachment, in consequence of which they used to have private interviews unknown to every soul upon earth, except her maid, who was necessarily entrusted with the secret. In this manner they enjoyed the conversation of each other for above 12 months, without the least interruption, and though the stability of Mr. M.'s fortune depended entirely upon their marriage, yet as he perceived his mistress so averse to it, he never urged it with vehemence, nor was at all anxious on that score, being easily induced to defer a ceremony which, as he then thought, could in no shape have added to their satisfaction, though he hath since altered his sentiments. Be that as it will, his indulgent mistress, in order to set his mind at ease in that particular, and in full confidence of his honour, insisted on his accepting a deed of gift of her whole fortune, in consideration of her intended marriage, and after some difficulty he was prevailed upon to receive this proof of her esteem, well knowing that it would still be in his power to return the obligation. Though she often entreated him to take upon himself the entire administration of her finances, and upon divers occasions pressed him to accept of large sums, he never once abused her generous disposition, or solicited her for money, except for some humane purpose, which she was always more ready to fulfil than he to propose. In the course of this correspondence he became acquainted with some of her female relations, and among the rest with a young lady so eminently adorned with all the qualifications of mind and person, that notwithstanding all his philosophy and caution, he could not behold and converse with her without being deeply smitten with her charms. He did all in his power to discourage this dangerous invasion in the beginning, and to conceal the least symptom of it from her relation. He summoned all his reflection to his aid, and thinking it would be base and dishonest to cherish any sentiment repugnant to the affection which he owed to a mistress who had placed such unlimited confidence in him, he attempted to stifle the infant flame by avoiding the amiable inspirer of it. But the passion had taken too deep a root in his heart to be so easily extirpated. His absence from the dear object increased the impatience of his love. The intestine conflict between that and gratitude deprived him of his rest and appetite. He was in a short time emaciated by continual watching, anxiety, and want of nourishment, and so much altered from his usual cheerfulness that his mistress, being surprised and alarmed at the change, which from the symptoms she judged was owing to some uneasiness of mind, took all imaginable pains to discover the cause. In all probability it did not escape her penetration, for she more than once asked if he was in love with her cousin, protesting that, far from being an obstacle to his happiness, she would in that case be an advocate for his passion. However, this declaration was never made without manifest signs of anxiety and uneasiness, which made such an impression upon the heart of him that he resolved to sacrifice his happiness and even his life rather than take any step which might be construed into an injury or insult to a person who had treated him with such generosity and goodness. In consequence of this resolution, he formed another, which was to go abroad, under pretence of recovering his health, but in reality to avoid the temptation, as well as the suspicion of being inconstant. And in this design he was confirmed by his physician, who actually thought him in the first stage of a consumption, and therefore advised him to repair to the south of France. He communicated his design, with the doctor's opinion, to the lady, who agreed to it with much less difficulty than he found in conquering his own reluctance at parting with the dear object of his love. The consent of his generous mistress being obtained, he waited upon her with the instrument whereby she had made the conveyance of her fortune to him. And all his remonstrances being insufficient to persuade her to take it back, he cancelled it in her presence, and placed it in that state upon her toilet, which she was dressing, whereupon she shed a torrent of tears, saying, she now plainly perceived that he wanted to tear himself from her, and that his affections were settled upon another. He was sensibly affected by this proof of her concern, and endeavoured to calm the perturbation of her mind by vowing eternal fidelity, and pressing her to accept of his hand in due form before his departure. By these means her transports were quieted for the present, and the marriage deferred for the same prudential reasons which had hitherto prevented it. Matters being thus compromised, and the day fixed for his departure, she, together with her faithful maid, one morning visited him for the first time at his own lodgings, and after breakfast, desiring to speak with him in private, he conducted her into another room, where, assuming an unusual gravity of aspect, "My dear M.," said she, "you are now going to leave me, and God alone knows if ever we shall meet again. Therefore, if you really love me with that tenderness which you profess, you will accept of this mark of my friendship and unalterable affection. It will at least be a provision for your journey, and if an accident should befall me before I have the happiness of receiving you again into my arms, I shall have the satisfaction of knowing that you are not altogether without resource." So saying, she put an embroidered pocket book into his hand. He expressed the high sense he had of her generosity and affection in the most pathetic terms, and begged leave to suspend his acceptance until he should know the contents of her present, which was so extraordinary that he absolutely refused to receive it. He was, however, by her repeated entreaties, in a manner compelled to receive about one half, and she afterwards insisted upon his taking a reinforcement of a considerable sum for the expense of his journey. Having stayed with her 10 days beyond the time he had fixed for his departure, and settled the method of their correspondence, he took his leave with a heart full of sorrow, anxiety, and distraction, produced from the different suggestions of his duty and love. He then set out for France, and after a short stay at Paris, proceeded to Aix-en-Provence, and from thence to Marseilles, at which two places he continued for some months. But nothing he met with being able to dissipate those melancholy ideas which still preyed upon his imagination and affected his spirits, he endeavoured to elude them with a succession of new objects, and with that view persuaded a councillor of the Parliament of Aix, a man of great worth, learning, and good humour, to accompany him in making a tour of those parts of France which he had not yet seen. On their return from this excursion they found at Aix an Italian abbé, a person of character and great knowledge of men and books, who, having travelled all over Germany and France, was so far on his return to his own country. M, having by means of his friend the councillor contracted an acquaintance with this gentleman, and being desirous of seeing some parts of Italy, particularly the Carnival at Venice, they set out together from Marseilles in a tartan for Genoa, coasting it all the way, and lying on shore every night. Having shown him what was most remarkable in this city, his friend the abbé was so obliging as to conduct him through Tuscany and the most remarkable cities in Lombardy to Venice, where M insisted upon defraying the expense of the whole tour, in consideration of the abbé's complaisance, which had been of infinite service to him in the course of this expedition. Having remained 5 weeks at Venice, he was preparing to set out for Rome with some English gentlemen whom he had met by accident, when he was all of a sudden obliged to change his resolution by some disagreeable letters which he received from London. He had, from his first departure, corresponded with his generous though inconstant mistress with a religious exactness and punctuality. Nor was she, for some time, less observant of the agreement they had made. Nevertheless, she by degrees became so negligent and cold in her expression, and so slack in her correspondence, that he could not help observing and upbraiding her with such indifference, and her endeavours to palliate it were supported by pretexts so frivolous as to be easily seen through by a lover of very little discernment. While he tortured himself with conjectures about the cause of this unexpected change, he received such intelligence from England as, when joined with what he himself had perceived by her manner of writing, left him little or no room to doubt of her fickleness and inconstancy. Nevertheless, as he knew by experience that informations of that kind are not to be entirely relied upon, he resolved to be more certainly apprised, and for that end departed immediately for London by the way of Tyrol, Bavaria, Alsace, and Paris. On his arrival in England he learned, with infinite concern, that his intelligence had not been at all exaggerated, and his sorrow was inexpressible to find a person endowed with so many other noble and amiable qualities seduced into an indiscretion that of necessity ruined the whole plan which had been concerted between them for their mutual happiness. She made several attempts by letters and interviews to palliate her conduct and soften him into a reconciliation, but his honour being concerned, he remained deaf to all her entreaties and proposals. Nevertheless, I have often heard him say that he could not help loving her, and revering the memory of a person to whose generosity and goodness he owed his fortune, and one whose foibles were overbalanced by 1,000 good qualities. He often insisted on making a restitution, but far from complying with that proposal, she afterwards often endeavoured to lay him under yet greater obligations of the same kind, and importuned him with the warmest solicitations to renew their former correspondence, which he as often declined. M took this instance of the inconstancy of the sex so much to heart, that he had almost resolved for the future to keep clear of all engagements for life, and return to Paris in order to dissipate his anxiety, where he hired an apartment in one of the academies, in the exercises whereof he took singular delight. During his residence at this place he had the good fortune to ingratiate himself with a great general, a descendant of one of the most ancient and illustrious families in France, having attracted his notice by some remarks he had written on Follard's Polybius, which were accidentally shown to that great man by one of his aides de camp, who was a particular friend of him. The favour he had thus acquired was strengthened by his assiduities and attention. Upon his return to London he sent some of Handel's newest compositions to the Prince, who was particularly fond of that gentleman's productions, together with Clarke's edition of Caesar, and in the spring of the same year, before the French army took the field, he was honoured with a most obliging letter from the Prince, inviting him to come over if he wanted to see the operations of the campaign, and desiring he would give himself no trouble about his equipage. M. having still some remains of a military disposition, and this to be a more favorable opportunity than any he should ever meet with again, readily embraced the offer, and sacrificed the soft delights of love, which at that time he enjoyed without control, to an eager, laborious, and dangerous curiosity. In that and the following campaign, during which he was present at the siege of Philipsburg and several other actions, he enlarged his acquaintance among the French officers, especially those of the graver sort, who had a taste for books and literature, and the friendship and interest of those gentlemen were afterwards of singular service to him, though in an affair altogether foreign from their profession. He had all along made diligent inquiry into the trade and manufactures of the countries through which he had occasion to travel, more particularly those of Holland, England, and France, and as he was well acquainted with the revenue and farms of this last kingdom, he saw with concern the great disadvantages under which our tobacco trade, the most considerable branch of our commerce with that people, was carried on. What inconsiderable returns were made to the planters out of the low price given by the French company, and how much it was in the power of that company to reduce it still lower. M. had formed a scheme to remedy this evil, so far as it related to the national loss or gain, by not permitting the duty of 1 penny in the pound, old subsidy, to be drawn back on tobacco re-exported. He demonstrated to the ministry of that time that so inconsiderable a duty could not in the least diminish the demand from abroad, which was the only circumstance to be apprehended, and that the yearly produce of that revenue would amount to £120,000 without 1 shilling additional expense to the public. But the ministry, having the excise scheme then in contemplation, could think of no other till that should be tried, and that project having miscarried, he renewed his application, when they approved of his scheme in every particular, but discovered a surprising backwardness to carry it into execution. His expectations in this quarter being disappointed, he, by the interposition of his friends, presented a plan to the French company, in which he set forth the advantages that would accrue to themselves from fixing the price, and securing that sort of tobacco which best suited the taste of the public and their manufacture, and finally proposed to furnish them with any quantity at the price which they paid in the port of London. After some dispute, they agreed to this proposal, and contracted with him for 15,000 hogsheads a year, for which they obliged themselves to pay ready money on its arrival in any one or more convenient ports in the south or western coasts of Great Britain, that he should please to fix upon for that purpose. M. no sooner obtained this contract than he immediately set out for America, in order to put it in execution, and by way of companion carried with him a little French abbé, a man of humour, wit, and learning, with whom he had been long acquainted, and for whom he had done many good offices. On his arrival in Virginia, which opportunely happened at a time when all the gentlemen were assembled in the capital of that province, he published a memorial representing the disadvantages under which their trade was carried on, the true method of redressing their own grievances in that respect, and proposing to contract with them for the yearly quantity of 15,000 hogsheads of such tobacco as was fit for the French market, at the price which he demonstrated to be considerably greater than that which they had formerly received. This remonstrance met with all the success and encouragement he could expect. The principal planters, seeing their own interests concerned, readily assented to the proposal, which, through their influence, was also relished by the rest, and the only difficulty that remained related to the security for payment of the bills on the arrival of the tobacco in England, and to the time stipulated for the continuance of the contract. In order to remove these objections, Mr. M. returned to Europe, and found the French company of farmers disposed to agree to everything he desired for facilitating the execution of the contract, and perfectly well pleased with the sample which he had already sent, but his good friend the Abbé, whom he had left behind him in America by an unparalleled piece of treachery, found means to overturn the whole project. He secretly wrote a memorial to the company, importing that he found by experience M. could afford to furnish them at a much lower price than that which they had agreed to give, and that by being in possession of the contract for 5 years, as was intended according to the proposal. He would have the company so much in his power that they must afterwards submit to any price he should please to impose, and that if they thought him worth of such a trust, he would undertake to furnish them at an easier rate, in conjunction with some of the leading men in Virginia and Maryland, with whom, he said, he had already concerted measures for that purpose. The company were so much alarmed at these insinuations that they declined complying with Mr. M.'s demands until the Abbé's return, and though they afterwards used all their endeavours to persuade him to be concerned with that little traitor in his undertaking, by which he might still have been a very considerable gainer, he resisted all their solicitations, and plainly told them, in the Abbé's presence, that he would never prostitute his own principles so far as to enter into engagements of any kind with a person of his character, much less in a scheme that had a manifest tendency to lower the market price of tobacco in England. Thus ended a project, the most extensive, simple, and easy, and, as appeared by the trial made, the best calculated to raise an immense fortune of any that was ever undertaken or planned by a private person, a project in the execution of which M. had the good of the public and the glory of putting in a flourishing condition the valuable branch of our trade which gives employment to 2 great provinces and above 200 sail of ships, much more at heart than his own private interest. It was reasonable to expect that a man whose debts M. had paid more than once, whom he had obliged in many other respects, and whom he had carried with him at a very considerable expense on this expedition, merely with a view of bettering his fortune, would have acted with common honesty, if not with gratitude. But such was the depravity of this little monster's heart, that on his deathbed he left a considerable fortune to mere strangers with whom he had little or no connection, without the least thought of refunding the money advanced for him by M., in order to prevent his rotting in a jail. When M. had once obtained a command of money, he, by his knowledge in several branches of trade, as well as by the assistance of some intelligent friends at Paris and London, found means to employ it to very good purpose, and had he been a man of that selfish disposition which too much prevails in the world, he might have been at this day master of a very ample fortune. But his ear was never deaf to the voice of distress, nor his beneficent heart shut against the calamities of his fellow creatures. He was even ingenious in contriving the most delicate methods of relieving modest indigence, and by his industrious benevolence often anticipated the requests of misery. I could relate a number of examples to illustrate my assertions, in some of which you would perceive the most disinterested generosity, but such a detail would trespass too much upon your time, and I do not pretend to dwell upon every minute circumstance of his conduct. Let it suffice to say, that upon the declaration of war in Spain, he gave up all his commercial schemes, and called in his money from all quarters, with a view of sitting down for the rest of his life, contented with what he had got, and restraining his liberalities to what he could spare from his yearly income. This was a very prudential resolution, could he have kept it, but upon the breaking out of the war, he could not without concern see many gentlemen of merit, who had been recommended to him, disappointed of commissions, merely for want of money to satisfy the expectations of the commission brokers of that time, and therefore launched out considerable sums for them on their bare notes, great part whereof was lost by the death of some in the unfortunate expedition to the West Indies. He at length, after many other actions of like nature, from motives of pure humanity, love of justice, and abhorrence of oppression, embarked in a cause every way the most important that ever came under the discussion of the courts of law in these kingdoms, whether it be considered in relation to the extraordinary nature of the case, or the immense property of no less than £50,000 a year, and 3 peerages that depended upon it. End of Chapter 98, Part 2. Chapter 98, Part 3 of The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 2, by Tobias SMOLLETT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In the year 1740, the brave admiral, who at that time commanded His Majesty's fleet in the West Indies, among the other transactions of his squadron, transmitted to the Duke of Newcastle, mentioned a young man, who, though in the capacity of a common sailor on board one of the ships under his command, laid claim to the estate and titles of the Earl of A. These pretensions were no sooner communicated in the public papers than they became the subject of conversation in all companies, and the person whom they chiefly affected, being alarmed at the appearance of a competitor, though at such a distance, began to put himself in motion and take all the precautions which he thought necessary to defeat the endeavor of the young upstart. Indeed, the early intelligence he received of Mr. A.'s making himself known in the West Indies furnished him with numberless advantages over that unhappy young gentleman, for being in possession of a splendid fortune, and lord of many manors in the neighborhood of the very place where the claimant was born, he knew all the witnesses who could give the most material evidence of his legitimacy, and if his probity did not restrain him, had, by his power and influence, sufficient opportunity and means of applying to the passions and interests of the witnesses to silence many and gain over others to his side, while his competitor, by an absence of 15 or 16 years from his native country, the want of education and friends, together with his present helpless situation, was rendered absolutely incapable of taking any step for his own advantage. And although his worthy uncle's conspicuous virtue and religious regard for justice and truth might possibly be an unconquerable restraint to his taking any undue advantages, yet the consciences of that huge army of emissaries he kept in pay were not altogether so very tender and scrupulous. This much, however, may be said, without derogation from, or impeachment of, the noble Earl's nice virtue and honor, that he took care to compromise all differences with the other branches of the family, whose interests were, in this affair, connected with his own, by sharing the estate with them, and also retained most of the eminent counsel within the bar of both kingdoms against this formidable bastard, before any suit was instituted by him. While he was thus entrenching himself against the attack of a poor forlorn youth, at the distance of 1500 leagues, continually exposed to the dangers of the sea, the war, and an unhealthy climate, Mr. M., in the common course of conversation, chanced to ask some questions relating to this romantic pretender of one H., who was at that time the present Lord A.'s chief agent. This man, when pressed, could not help owning that the late Lord A. actually left a son who had been spirited away into America soon after his father's death, but said he did not know whether this was the same person. This information could not fail to make an impression on the humanity of Mr. M., who, being acquainted with the genius of the wicked party who had possessed themselves of this unhappy young man's estate and honors, expressed no small anxiety and apprehension lest they should take him off by some means or other, and even then seemed disposed to contribute towards the support of the friendless orphan, and to inquire more circumstantially into the nature of his claim. In the meantime his occasions called him to France, and during his absence Mr. A. arrived in London in the month of October, 1741. Here the clergyman was interrupted by Peregrine, who said there was something so extraordinary, not to call it improbable, in the account he had heard of the young gentleman's being sent into exile, that he would look upon himself as infinitely obliged to the doctor if he would favor him with a true representation of that transaction, as well as of the manner in which he arrived and was known at the island of Jamaica. The parson, in compliance with our hero's request, taking up the story from the beginning, "Mr. A," said he, "is the son of Arthur, late Lord Baron of A, by his wife Mary S., natural daughter of John, Duke of B and N, whom he publicly married on the 21st day of July, 1706, contrary to the inclination of his mother, and all his other relations, particularly of Arthur, late Earl of A, who bore an implacable enmity to the Duke her father, and for that reason did all that lay in his power to traverse the marriage. But finding his endeavors ineffectual, he was so much offended that he would never be perfectly reconciled to Lord A, though he was his presumptive heir. After their nuptials they cohabited together in England for the space of 2 or 3 years, during which she miscarried more than once, and he, being a man of levity and an extravagant disposition, not only squandered away all that he had received of his wife's fortune, but also contracted many considerable debts, which obliged him to make a precipitate retreat into Ireland, leaving his lady behind him in the house with his mother and sister, who, having also been averse to the match, had always looked upon her with eyes of disgust. It was not likely that harmony should long subsist in this family, especially as Lady A was a woman of a lofty spirit, who could not tamely bear insults and ill usage from persons who, she had reason to believe, were her enemies at heart. Accordingly, a misunderstanding soon happened among them, which was fomented by the malice of one of her sisters-in-law. Divers scandalous reports of her misconduct, to which the empty pretensions of a vain, wretched coxcomb, who was made use of as an infamous tool for that purpose, gave a colorable pretext, were trumped up and transmitted, with many false and aggravating circumstances, to her husband in Ireland, who, being a giddy, unthinking man, was so much incensed at these insinuations, that in the first transports of his passion he sent to his mother a power of attorney, that she might sue for a divorce in his behalf. A libel was thereupon exhibited, containing many scandalous allegations, void of any real foundation in truth, but being unsupported by any manner of proof, it was at length dismissed with costs, after it had depended upwards of 2 years. Lord A, finding himself abused by the misrepresentations of his mother and sister, discovered an inclination to be reconciled to his lady, in consequence of which she was sent over to Dublin by her father, to the care of a gentleman in that city, in whose house she was received by her husband with all the demonstrations of love and esteem. From thence he conducted her to his lodgings, and thence to his country house, where she had the misfortune to suffer a miscarriage through fear and resentment of my lord's behaviour, which was often brutal and indecent. From the country they removed to Dublin about the latter end of July, or beginning of August, 1714, where they had not long continued, when her ladyship was known to be again with child. Lord A, and his issue, being next in remainder to the honours and estate of Arthur Earl of A, was extremely solicitous to have a son, and, warned by the frequent miscarriages of his lady, resolved to curb the natural impatience and rusticity of his disposition, that she might not, as formerly, suffer by his outrageous conduct. He accordingly cherished her with uncommon tenderness and care, and her pregnancy being pretty far advanced, conducted her to his country seat, where she was delivered of Mr. A, about the latter end of April or beginning of May, for none of the witnesses have been able at this distance with absolute certainty to fix the precise time of his birth, and there was no register kept in the parish. As an additional misfortune, no gentleman of fashion lived in that parish, nor did those who lived at any considerable distance care to cultivate an acquaintance with a man of Lord A.'s strange conduct. Be that as it will, the occasion was celebrated by his lordship's tenants and dependents upon the spot, and in the neighbouring town of New Ar, by bonfires, illuminations, and other rejoicings, which have made such an impression upon the minds of the people, that in the place where they happened, and the contiguous parishes, several hundred persons have already declared their knowledge and remembrance of this event, in spite of the great power of the claimant's adversary in that quarter, and the great pains and indirect methods taken by his numberless agents and emissaries, as well as by those who are interested with him in the event of the suit, to corrupt and suppress the evidence. Lord A, after the birth of his son, who was sent to nurse in the neighbourhood, according to the custom of the country, where people of the highest distinction put their children out to nurse into farmhouses and cabins, lived in harmony with his lady for the space of 2 years, but having by his folly and extravagance reduced himself to great difficulties, he demanded the remainder of her fortune from her father, the Duke of B, who absolutely refused to part with a shilling until a proper settlement should be made on his daughter, which by that time he had put out of his own power to make by his folly and extravagance. As her ladyship, by her endeavours to reform the economy of her house, had incurred the displeasure of some idle profligate fellows who had fastened themselves upon her husband, and helped to consume his substance, they seized this opportunity of the Duke's refusal, and in order to be revenged upon the innocent lady, persuaded Lord A that the only means of extracting money from his grace would be to turn her away, on pretence of infidelity to his bed, for which they hinted there was but too much foundation. At their suggestions a most infamous plan was projected, in the execution of which one P., a poor, unbred, simple country booby, whom they had decoyed into a snare, lost one of his ears, and the injured lady retired the same day to New Ar, where she continued several years. She did not, however, leave the house without struggling hard to carry her child along with her, but far from enjoying such indulgence, strict orders were given that the boy should not, for the future, be brought within her sight. This base, inhuman treatment, instead of answering the end proposed, produced such a contrary effect, that the Duke of B., by a codicil to his will, in which he reflects upon Lord A.'s evil temper, directed his executors to pay to his daughter an annuity of £100, while her lord and she should continue to live separate, and this allowance was to cease on Lord A.'s death. While she remained in this solitary situation, the child was universally known and received as the legitimate son and heir of her lord, whose affection for the boy was so conspicuous that, in the midst of his own necessities, he never failed to maintain him in the dress and equipage of a young nobleman. In the course of his infancy, his father having often changed his place of residence, the child was put under the instructions of a great many different schoolmasters, so that he was perfectly well known in a great many different parts of the kingdom, and his mother seized all opportunities, which were but rare, on account of his father's orders to the contrary, of seeing and giving him proofs of her maternal tenderness, until she set out for England, after having been long in a declining state of health by a paralytical disorder, upon the consequence of which such dependence was placed by her inconsiderate husband, who was by this time reduced to extreme poverty, that he actually married a woman whom he had long kept as a mistress. This creature no sooner understood that Lady A. was departed from Ireland, than she openly avowed her marriage, and went about publicly with Lord A., visiting his acquaintances in the character of his wife. From this era may be dated the beginning of Mr. A.'s misfortune. This artful woman, who had formerly treated the child with an appearance of fondness, in order to ingratiate herself with the father, now looking upon herself as sufficiently established in the family, thought it was high time to alter her behavior with regard to the unfortunate boy, and accordingly, for obvious reasons, employed 1,000 artifices to alienate the heart of the weak father from his unhappy offspring. Yet, notwithstanding all her insinuations, nature still maintained her influence in his heart, and though she often found means to irritate him by artful and malicious accusations, his resentment never extended farther than fatherly correction. She would have found it impossible to accomplish his ruin, had not her efforts been reinforced by a new auxiliary, who was no other than his uncle, the present usurper of his title and estate. Yet even this confederacy was overawed in some measure by the fear of alarming the unfortunate mother, until her distemper increased to a most deplorable degree of the dead palsy, and the death of her father had reduced her to a most forlorn and abject state of distress. Then they ventured upon the execution of their projects, and though their aims were widely different, concurred in their endeavors to remove the hapless boy as the common obstacle to both. Lord A., who, as I have already observed, was a man of weak intellects, and utterly void of any fixed principle of action, being by this time reduced to such a pitch of misery that he was often obliged to pawn his wearing apparel in order to procure the common necessaries of life, and having no other fund remaining with which he could relieve his present necessities, except a sale of the reversion of the A. estate, to which the nonage of his son was an effectual bar, he was advised by his virtuous brother and the rest of his counsellors to surmount this difficulty by secreting his son and spreading a report of his death. This honest project he the more readily embraced, because he knew that no act of his could frustrate the child's succession. Accordingly, the boy was removed from the school at which he was then boarded, to the house of one K., an agent and accomplice of the present Earl of A., where he was kept for several months closely confined, and in the meantime it was industriously reported that he was dead. This previous measure being taken, Lord A. published advertisements in the gazettes offering reversions of the A. estate to sale, and emissaries of various kinds were employed to inveigle such as were ignorant of the nature of the settlement of these estates, or strangers to the affairs of his family. Some people, imposed upon by the report of the child's death, were drawn in to purchase, thinking themselves safe in the concurrence of his lordship's brother, upon presumption that he was next in remainder to the succession. Others, tempted by the smallness of the price, which rarely exceeded half a year's purchase, as appears by many deeds, though they doubted the truth of the boy's being dead, ran small risks on the contingency of his dying before he should be of age, or in hopes of his being prevailed upon to confirm the grants of his father. And many more were treating with him on the same notions, when their transactions were suddenly interrupted, and the scheme of raising more money for the present defeated by the unexpected appearance of the boy, who, being naturally sprightly and impatient of restraint, had found means to break from his confinement, and wandered up and down the streets of Dublin, avoiding his father's house, and choosing to encounter all sorts of distress rather than subject himself again to the cruelty and malice of the woman who supplied his mother's place. Thus debarred his father's protection, and destitute of any fixed habitation, he herded with all the loose, idle, and disorderly youths in Dublin, skulking chiefly about the college, several members and students of which, taking pity on his misfortunes, supplied him at different times with clothes and money. In this unsettled and uncomfortable way of life did he remain from the year 1725 to the latter end of November, 1727, at which time his father died, so miserably poor that he was actually buried at the public expense. This unfortunate nobleman was no sooner dead than his brother Richard, now Earl of A, taking advantage of the nonage and helpless situation of his nephew, seized upon all the papers of the defunct, and afterwards usurped the title of Lord A, to the surprise of the servants and others who were acquainted with the affairs of the family. This usurpation, bold as it was, produced no other effect than that of his being insulted by the populace as he went through the streets, and the refusal of the King at Arms to enroll the certificate of his brother's having died without issue. The first of these inconveniences he bore without any sense of shame, though not without repining, conscious that it would gradually vanish with the novelty of his invasion; and as to the last, he conquered it by means well known and obvious. Nor will it seem strange that he should thus invade the rights of an orphan with impunity, if people will consider that the late Lord A had not only squandered away his fortune with the most ridiculous extravagance, but also associated himself with low company, so that he was little known and less regarded by persons of any rank and figure in life; and his child, of consequence, debarred of the advantages which might have accrued from valuable connections. And though it was universally known that Lady A had a son in Ireland, such was the obscurity in which the father had lived during the last years of his life, that few of the nobility could be supposed to be acquainted with the particular circumstances of a transaction in which they had no concern, and which had happened at the distance of 12 years before the date of this usurpation. Moreover, as their first information was no other than common fame, the public clamor occasioned by the separation might inspire such as were strangers to the family affairs with a mistaken notion of the child's having been born about or after the time of that event. The hurry and bustle occasioned by the arrival of the Lord Lieutenant about this period, the reports industriously propagated of the claimant's death, the obscurity and concealment in which the boy was obliged to live in order to elude the wicked attempts of his uncle, might also contribute to his peaceable enjoyment of an empty title. And lastly, Lord Chancellor W, whose immediate province it was to issue writs for Parliament, was an utter stranger in Ireland, unacquainted with the descents of families, and consequently did not examine farther than the certificate enrolled in the books of the King at Arms. Over and above these circumstances, which naturally account for the success of the imposture, it may be observed that the hapless youth had not one relation alive on the side of his father, whose interest it was not to forward or connive at his destruction; that his grandfather, the Duke of B, was dead; and that his mother was then in England in a forlorn, destitute, dying condition, secreted from the world, and even from her own relations, by her woman, Mary H., who had a particular interest to secrete her, and altogether dependent upon a miserable and precarious allowance from the Duchess of B, to whose caprice she was moreover a most wretched slave. Notwithstanding these concurring circumstances in favor of the usurper, he did not think himself secure while the orphan had any chance of finding a friend who would undertake his cause, and therefore laid a plan for his being kidnapped and sent to America as a slave. His coadjutor in this inhuman scheme was a person who carried on the trade of transporting servants to our plantations, and was deeply interested on this occasion for having, for a mere trifle, purchased of the late Lord A. the reversion of a considerable part of the A. estate, which shameful bargain was confirmed by the brother, but could never take place unless the boy could be effectually removed. Everything being settled with his auxiliary, several ruffians were employed in search of the unhappy victim, and the first attempt that was made upon him, in which his uncle personally assisted, happening near one of the great markets of the city of Dublin, an honest butcher, with the assistance of his neighbors, rescued him by force from their cruel hands. This, however, was but a short respite, for though warned by this adventure, the boy seldom crept out of his lurking places without the most cautious circumspection. He was in March, 1727, discovered by the diligence of his persecutors, and forcibly dragged on board of a ship bound for Newcastle, on Delaware River in America, where he was sold as a slave, and kept to hard labor, much above his age or strength, for the space of 13 years, during which he was transferred from one person to another. While he remained in this servile situation, he often mentioned to those in whom he thought such confidence might be placed the circumstances of his birth and title, together with the manner of his being exiled from his native country, although in this particular he neglected a caution which he had received in his passage, importing that such a discovery would cost him his life. Meanwhile the usurper quietly enjoyed his right, and to those who questioned him about his brother's son, constantly replied that the boy had been dead for several years, and Arthur, Earl of A., dying in April, 1737, he, upon pretense of being next heir, succeeded to the honors and estate of that nobleman. The term of the nephew's bondage, which had been lengthened out beyond the usual time, on account of his repeated attempts to escape, being expired in the year 1739, he hired himself as a common sailor in a trading vessel bound to Jamaica, and there being entered on board of one of his Majesty's ships under the command of Admiral Vernon, openly declared his parentage and pretensions. This extraordinary claim, which made a great noise in the fleet, reaching the ears of one Lieutenant S., nearly related to the usurper's Irish wife, he believed the young gentleman to be an impostor, and thinking it was incumbent on him to discover the cheat, he went on board the ship to which the claimant belonged, and having heard the account which he gave of himself, was, notwithstanding his prepossessions, convinced of the truth of what he alleged. On his return to his own ship, he chanced to mention this extraordinary affair upon the quarter-deck in the hearing of Mr. B., one of the midshipmen who had formerly been at school with Mr. A. This young gentleman not only told the lieutenant that he had been schoolfellow with Lord A.'s son, but also declared that he should know him again, if not greatly altered, as he still retained a perfect idea of his countenance. Upon this intimation the lieutenant proposed that the experiment should be tried, and went with the midshipmen on board the ship that the claimant was on for that purpose. After all the sailors had been assembled upon deck, Mr. B., casting his eyes around, immediately distinguished Mr. A. in the crowd, and laying his hand on his shoulder, "This is the man," said he, affirming at the same time that, while he continued at school with him, the claimant was reputed and respected as Lord A.'s son and heir, and maintained in all respects suitable to the dignity of his rank. Nay, he was in like manner recognized by several other persons in the fleet who had known him in his infancy. These things being reported to the admiral, he generously ordered him to be supplied with necessaries, and treated like a gentleman, and in his next dispatches transmitted an account of the affair to the Duke of Newcastle, among the other transactions of the fleet. In September or October 1741, Mr. A. arrived in London, and the first person to whom he applied for advice and assistance was a man of the law, nearly related to the families of A. and A., and well acquainted with the particular affairs of each, who, far from treating him as a bastard and impostor, received him with civility and seeming kindness, asked him to eat, presented him with a piece of money, and, excusing himself from meddling in the affair, advised him to go to Ireland as the most proper place for commencing a suit for the recovery of his right. Before the young gentleman had an opportunity, or indeed any inclination, to comply with this advice, he was accidentally met in the street by that same H., who, as I have mentioned, gave Mr. M. the first insight into the affair. This man immediately knew the claimant, having been formerly an agent for his father, and afterwards a creature of his uncle's, with whom he was, not without reason, suspected to be concerned in kidnapping and transporting his nephew. Be that as it will, his connections with the usurper were now broken off by a quarrel, in consequence of which he had thrown up his agency, and he invited the hapless stranger to his house with a view of making all possible advantage of such a guest. There he had not long remained when his treacherous landlord, tampering with his inexperience, effected a marriage between him and the daughter of one of his own friends, who lodged in his house at the same time. But afterwards, seeing no person of consequence willing to espouse his cause, he looked upon him as an encumbrance, and wanted to rid his hands of him accordingly. He remembered that Mr. M. had expressed himself with all the humanity of apprehension in favour of the unfortunate young nobleman, before his arrival in England, and being well acquainted with the generosity of his disposition, he no sooner understood that he was returned from France, than he waited upon him with an account of Mr. A.'s being safely arrived. Mr. M. was sincerely rejoiced to find that a person who had been so cruelly injured, and undergone so long and continued a scene of distress, was restored to a country where he was sure of obtaining justice, and where every good man, as he imagined, would make the cause his own. And being informed that the youth was in want of necessaries, he gave 20 guineas to H. for his use, and promised to do him all the service in his power, but had no intention to take upon himself the whole weight of such an important affair, or indeed to appear in the cause, until he should be fully and thoroughly satisfied that the claimant's pretensions were well founded. In the meantime, H., insinuating that the young gentleman was not safe in his present lodging from the machinations of his enemies, M. accommodated him with an apartment in his own house, where he was at great pains to remedy the defect in his education by rendering him fit to appear as a gentleman in the world. Having received from him all the intelligence he could give relating to his own affair, he laid the case before council, and dispatched a person to Ireland to make further inquiries upon the same subject, who, in his first arrival in that kingdom, found the claimant's birth was as publicly known as any circumstance of that kind could possibly be, at so great a distance of time. The usurper and his friends gave all the interruption in their power to any researches concerning that affair, and had recourse to every art and expedient that could be invented to prevent its being brought to a legal discussion. Privilege, bills in chancery, orders of court surreptitiously and illegally obtained, and every other invention was made use of to bar and prevent a fair and honest trial by a jury. The usurper himself and his agents, at the same time that they formed divers conspiracies against his life, in vain endeavored to detach Mr. M. from the orphan's cause by innumerable artifices, insinuating, cajoling, and misrepresenting, with surprising dexterity and perseverance. His protector, far from being satisfied with their reasons, was not only deaf to their remonstrances, but believing him in danger from their repeated efforts, had him privately conveyed into the country, where an unhappy accident, which he hath ever since sincerely regretted, furnished his adversary with a colorable pretext to cut him off in the beginning of his career. End of chapter 98, part 3. Chapter 98, Part 4 of The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 2, by Tobias Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 98, Part 4. A man happening to lose his life by the accidental discharge of a piece that chanced to be in a young gentleman's hands, the account of this misfortune no sooner reached the ears of his uncle than he expressed the most immoderate joy in having found so good a handle for destroying him under colour of law. He immediately constituted himself prosecutor, set his emissaries at work to secure a coroner's inquest suited to his cruel purposes, set out for the place in person to take care that the prisoner should not escape, insulted him in jail in the most inhuman manner, employed a whole army of attorneys and agents to spirit up and carry on a most virulent prosecution, practised all the unfair methods that could be invented, in order that the unhappy gentleman should be transported to Newgate from the healthy prison to which he was at first committed, endeavored to inveigle him into destructive confessions, and not to mention other more infamous arts employed in the affair of evidence, attempted to surprise him upon his trial in the absence of his witnesses and counsel, contrary to a previous agreement with the prosecutor's own attorney. Nay, he even appeared in person upon the bench at the trial, in order to intimidate the evidence, and browbeat the unfortunate prisoner at the bar, and expended above £1,000 in that prosecution. In spite of all his wicked efforts, however, which were defeated by the spirit and the indefatigable industry of Mr. M., the young gentleman was honourably acquitted, to the evident satisfaction of all the impartial, the misfortune that gave a handle for that unnatural prosecution appearing to a demonstration to have been a mere accident. In a few months his protector, who had now openly espoused his cause, taking with him 2 gentlemen to witness his transactions, conducted him to his native country with a view to be better informed of the strength of his pretensions than he could be by the intelligence he had hitherto received, or by the claimant's own dark and almost obliterated remembrance of the facts which were essential to be known. Upon their arrival in Dublin, application was made to those persons whom Mr. A. had named as his schoolmasters and companions, together with the servants and neighbors of his father. These, though examined separately, without having the least previous intimation of what the claimant had reported, agreed in their accounts with him as well as with one another, and mentioned many other people as acquainted with the same facts, to whom Mr. M. had recourse, and still met with the same unvaried information. By these means he made such progress in his inquiries that, in less than 2 months, no fewer than 100 persons from different quarters of the kingdom, either personally or by letters, communicated their knowledge of the claimant in declarations consonant with one another, as well as with the accounts he gave of himself. Several servants who had lived with his father and been deceived with the story of his death, so industriously propagated by his uncle, no sooner heard of his being in Dublin than they came from different parts of the country to see him, and though great pains were taken to deceive them, they nevertheless knew him at first sight. Some of them fell upon their knees to thank for his preservation, embraced his legs, and shed tears of joy for his return. Although the conduct of his adversary, particularly in the above-mentioned prosecution, together with the evidence that already appeared, were sufficient to convince all mankind of the truth of the claimant's pretensions, Mr. M., in order to be further satisfied, resolved to see how he would be received upon the spot where he was born, justly concluding that if he was really an impostor, the bastard of a kitchen wench, produced in a country entirely possessed by its enemy and his allies, he must be looked upon in that place with the utmost detestation and contempt. This his intention was no sooner known to the adverse party than their agents and friends from all quarters repaired to that place with all possible dispatch, and used all their influence with the people in remonstrances, threats, and all the other arts they could devise, not only to discountenance the claimant upon his arrival, but even to spirit up a mob to insult him. Notwithstanding these precautions, and the servile awe and subjection in which tenants are kept by their landlords in that part of the country, as soon as it was known that Mr. A. approached the town, the inhabitants crowded out in great multitudes to receive and welcome him, and accompanied him into town with acclamations and other expressions of joy, insomuch that the agents of his adversary durst not show their faces. The sovereign of the corporation, who was a particular creature and favorite of the usurper, and whose all depended upon the issue of the cause, was so conscious of the stranger's right, and so much awed by the behavior of the people, who knew that consciousness, that he did not think it safe even to preserve the appearance of neutrality upon this occasion, but actually held the stirrup while Mr. A. dismounted from his horse. This sense of conviction in the people manifested itself still more powerfully when he returned to the same place in the year 1744, about which time Lord A., being informed of his resolution, determined again to be beforehand with him, and set out in person with his agents and friends, some of whom were detached before him to prepare for his reception, and induce the people to meet him in a body, and accompany him to town, with such expressions of welcome as they had before bestowed on his nephew. But in spite of all their art and interest, he was suffered to pass through the street in a mournful silence, and though several barrels of beer were produced to court the favor of the populace, they had no other effect than that of drawing their ridicule upon the donor, whereas when Mr. A. 2 days afterwards appeared, all the inhabitants, with garlands, streamers, music, and other ensigns of joy, crowded out to meet him, and ushered him into town with such demonstrations of pleasure and goodwill, that the noble peer found it convenient to hide himself from the resentment of his own tenants, the effects of which he must have severely felt, had not he been screened by the timely remonstrances of Mr. M. and the other gentlemen who accompanied his competitor. Nor did his apprehension vanish with the transaction of this day. The town was again in uproar on the Sunday following, when it was known that Mr. A. intended to come thither from Dunmayne to church. They went out to meet him as before, and conducted him to the church door with acclamations, which terrified his uncle to such a degree that he fled with precipitation in a boat, and soon after entirely quitted the place. It would be almost an endless task to enumerate the particular steps that were taken by one side to promote, and by the other to delay, the trial. The young gentleman's adversaries, finding that they could not, by all the subterfuges and arts they had used, evade it, repeatedly attempts were made to assassinate him and his protector, and every obstruction thrown in the way of his cause, witchcraft could invent, villainy execute, and undue influence confirm. But all these difficulties were surmounted by the vigilance, constancy, courage, and sagacity of M. And at last the affair was brought to a very solemn trial at bar, which being continued by several adjournments from the 11th to the 25th day of November, a verdict was found for the claimant by a jury of gentlemen, which in point of reputation and property cannot be easily paralleled in the annals of that or any other country. A jury that could by no means be suspected of prepossessions in favor of Mr. A., to whose person they were absolute strangers, especially if we consider that a gentleman in their neighborhood, who was nephew to the foreman, and nearly related to some of the rest of their number, forfeited a considerable estate by their decision. This verdict, said the parson, gave the highest satisfaction to all impartial persons that were within reach of being duly informed of their proceedings, and of the different genius and conduct of the parties engaged in the contest; but more especially to such as were in court, as I was, at the trial, and had an opportunity of observing the characters and behavior of the persons who appeared there to give evidence. To such it was very apparent that all the witnesses produced there on the part of the uncle were either his tenants, dependents, pot companions, or persons some way or other interested in the issue of the suit, and remarkable for a low kind of cunning, that many of them were persons of profligate lives who deserved no credit, that independent of the levity of their characters, those of them who went under the denomination of colonels, Colonel L. alone excepted, who had nothing to say and was only brought there in order to give credit to that party, made so ridiculous a figure, and gave so absurd, contradictory, and inconsistent an evidence, as no court or jury could give the least degree of credit to. On the other hand, it was observed that the nephew and Mr. M., his chief manager, being absolute strangers in that country, and unacquainted with the characters of the persons they had to deal with, were obliged to lay before the court and jury such evidence as came to their hand, some of whom plainly appeared to have been put upon them by their adversaries with a design to hurt. It was also manifest that the witnesses produced for Mr. A. were such as could have no manner of connection with him, nor any dependence whatsoever upon him to influence their evidence; for the far greatest part of them had never seen him from his infancy till the trial began, and many of them, though poor, and undignified with the title of colonels, were people of unblemished character, of great simplicity, and such as no man in his senses would pitch upon to support a bad cause. It is plain that the jury, whose well-known honor, impartiality, and penetration must be revered by all who are acquainted with them, were not under the least difficulty about their verdict, for they were not enclosed above half an hour when they returned with it. These gentlemen could not help observing the great inequality of the parties engaged, the great advantages that the uncle had in every other respect, except the truth and justice of his case, over the nephew by means of his vast possessions, and of his power and influence all round the place of his birth; nor could the contrast between the different geniuses of the two parties escape their observation. They could not but see and conclude that a person who had confessedly transported and sold his orphan nephew into slavery, who on his return had carried on so unwarrantable and cruel a prosecution to take away his life under color of law, and who had also given such glaring proofs of his skill and dexterity in the management of witnesses for that cruel purpose, was in like manner capable of exerting the same happy talent on this occasion when his all was at stake, more especially as he had so many others who were equally interested with himself, and whose abilities in that respect fell nothing short of his own, to second him in it. The gentlemen of the jury had also a near view of the manner in which the witnesses delivered their testimonies, and had from thence an opportunity of observing many circumstances and distinguishing characteristics of truth and falsehood, from which a great deal could be gathered that could not be adequately conveyed by any printed account, how exact soever. Consequently, they must have been much better judges of the evidence on which they founded their verdict than any person who had not the same opportunity can possibly be. These, Mr. Pickle, were my reflections on what I had occasion to observe concerning that famous trial, and on my return to England 2 years after, I could not help pitying the self-sufficiency of some people who at this distance pretended to pass their judgment on that verdict with as great positiveness as if they had been in the secrets of the cause, or upon the jury who tried it, and that from no better authority than the declamations of Lord A.'s emissaries, and some falsified printed accounts, artfully cooked up on purpose to mislead and deceive. But to return from this digression, Lord A., the defendant in that cause, was so conscious of the strength and merits of his injured nephew's case, and that a verdict would go against him, that he ordered a writ of error to be made out before the trial was ended, and the verdict was no sooner given than he immediately lodged it, though he well knew he had no manner of error to assign. This expedient was practised merely for vexation and delay, in order to keep Mr. A. from the possession of the small estate he had recovered by the verdict, that his slender funds being exhausted, he might be deprived of other means to prosecute his right, and by the most oppressive contrivances and scandalous chicanery it has been kept up to this day, without his being able to assign the least shadow of any error. Lord A. was not the only antagonist that Mr. A. had to deal with. All the different branches of the A. family, who had been worrying one another at law ever since the death of the late Earl of A. about the partition of his great estate, were now firmly united in an association against this unfortunate gentleman. Mutual deeds were executed among them, by which many great lordships and estates were given up by the uncle to persons who had no right to possess them, in order to engage them to side with him against his nephew, in withholding the unjust possession of the remainder. These confederates, having held several consultations against their common enemy, and finding that his cause gathered daily strength since the trial, by the accession of many witnesses of figure and reputation who had not been heard of before, and that the only chance they had to prevent the speedy establishment of his right and their own destruction was by stripping Mr. M. of the little money that yet remained, and by stopping all further resources whereby he might be enabled to proceed. They therefore came to a determined resolution to carry that hopeful scheme into execution, and in pursuance thereof they have left no expedient or stratagem, how extraordinary or scandalous soever, unpractised to distress Mr. A. and that gentleman. For that end, all the oppressive arts and dilatory expensive contrivances that the fertile invention of the lowest pettifoggers of the law could possibly devise, have with dexterity been played off against them, in fruitless quibbling and malicious suits, entirely foreign to the merits of the cause. Not to mention numberless other acts of oppression, the most extraordinary and unprecedented proceeding, by means whereof this sham writ of error hath been kept on foot ever since November 1743, is to me, said the doctor, a most flagrant instance not only of the prevalency of power money when employed, as in the present case, against an unfortunate helpless man, disabled as he is of the means of ascertaining his right, but of the badness of a cause that hath recourse to so many iniquitous expedients to support it. In a word, the whole conduct of Lord A. and his party from the beginning to this time hath been such as sufficiently manifests that it could proceed from no other motives than a consciousness of Mr. A.'s right, and of their own illegal usurpations, and from a terror of trusting the merits of their case to a fair discussion by the laws of their country. and that the intention and main drift of all their proceedings plainly tends to stifle and smother the merits of the case from the knowledge of the world by oppressive arts and ingenious delays, rather than trust it to the candid determination of an honest jury. What else could be the motives of kidnapping the claimant and transporting him when an infant, of the various attempts made upon his life since his return, of the attempts to divest him of all assistance to ascertain his right, by endeavoring so solicitously to prevail on Mr. M. to abandon him in the beginning, of retaining an army of counsel before any suit had been commenced, of the many sinister attempts to prevent the trial at bar, of the various arts made use of to terrify any one from appearing as witness for the claimant, and to seduce those who had appeared, of the shameless, unprecedented, low tricks now practiced to keep him out of the possession of that estate for which he had obtained the verdict, thereby to disable him from bringing his cause to a further hearing, and of the attempts made to buy up Mr. M.'s debts and to spirit up suits against him. Is it not obvious from all these circumstances, as well as from the obstruction they have given to the Attorney General's proceeding to make a report to His Majesty on the claimant's petition to the King for the peerage, which was referred by His Majesty to that gentleman so far back as 1743, that all their efforts are bent to that one point, of stifling rather than suffering the merits of this cause to come to a fair and candid hearing, and that the sole consideration at present between them and this unfortunate man is not whether he is right or wrong, but whether he shall or shall not find money to bring this cause to a final determination. Lord A. and his confederates, not thinking themselves safe with all these expedients, while there was a possibility of their antagonists obtaining any assistance from such as humanity, compassion, generosity, or a love of justice might induce to lay open their purses to his assistance in ascertaining his right, have by themselves and their numerous emissaries employed all the arts of calumny, slander, and detraction against him, by traducing his cause, vilifying his person, and most basely and cruelly tearing his character to pieces, by 1,000 misrepresentations purposely invented and industriously propagated in all places of resort, which is a kind of cowardly assassination that there is no guarding against. Yet in spite of all these machinations and the shameful indifference of mankind, who stand aloof unconcerned, and see this unhappy gentleman most inhumanly oppressed by the weight of lawless power and faction, M., far from suffering himself to be dejected by the multiplying difficulties that crowd upon him, still exerts himself with amazing fortitude and assiduity, and will, I doubt not, bring the affair he began and carried on with so much spirit, while his finances lasted, to a happy conclusion. It would exceed the bounds of my intention, and perhaps trespass too much upon your time, were I to enumerate the low artifices and shameful quibbles by which the usurper has found means to procrastinate the decision of the contest between him and his hapless nephew, or to give a detail of the damage and perplexity which Mr. M. has sustained and been involved in by the treachery and ingratitude of some who listed themselves under him in the prosecution of this affair, and by the villainy of others, who, under various pretenses of material discoveries they had to make, etc., had fastened themselves upon him, and continued to do all the mischief in their power, until the cloven foot was detected. One instance, however, is so flagrantly flagitious, that I cannot resist the inclination I feel to relate it as an example of the most infernal perfidy that perhaps ever entered the human heart. I have already mentioned the part which H. enacted in the beginning of M.'s connection with the unfortunate stranger, and hinted that the said H. lay under many obligations to that gentleman before Mr. A.'s arrival in England. He had been chief agent to Lord A., and, as it afterwards appeared, received several payments of a secret pension which that lord enjoyed, for which he either could not or would not account. His lordship, therefore, in order to compel him to it, took out writs against him, and his house was continually surrounded with catchpoles for the space of 2 whole years. Mr. M., believing, from H.'s own account of the matter, that the poor man was greatly injured and prosecuted on account of his attachment to the unhappy young gentleman, did him all the good offices in his power, and became security for him on several occasions. Nay, such was his opinion of his integrity, that after Mr. A. was cleared of the prosecution carried on against him by his uncle, his person was entrusted to the care of this hypocrite, who desired that the young gentleman might lodge at his house for the convenience of air, M.'s own occasions calling him often into the country. Having thus, by his consummate dissimulation, acquired such a valuable charge, he wrote a letter to one of Lord A.'s attorneys, offering to betray Mr. A., provided his lordship would settle his account, and give him a discharge for £800 of the pension which he had received and not accounted for. Mr. M., informed of this treacherous proposal, immediately removed his lodger from his house into his own, without assigning his reasons for so doing, until he was obliged to declare it in order to free himself from the importunities of H., who earnestly solicited his return. This miscreant, finding himself detected and disappointed in his villainous design, was so much enraged at his miscarriage, that forgetting all the benefits he had received from M. for a series of years, he practised all the mischief that his malice could contrive against him, and at length entered into a confederacy with one G. and several other abandoned wretches, who, as before said, under various pretences of being able to make material discoveries, and otherwise to serve the cause, had found means to be employed in some extra business relating to it, though their real intention was to betray the claimant. These confederates, in conjunction with some other auxiliaries of infamous character, being informed that Mr. M. was on the point of securing a considerable sum to enable him to prosecute Mr. A.'s right, and to bring it to a happy conclusion, contrived a deep laid scheme to disappoint him in it, and at once to ruin the cause. End of chapter 98, part 4. Chapter 98, part 5 of The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 2, by Tobias SMOLLETT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 98, part 5. And previous measures being taken for that wicked purpose, they imposed upon the young gentleman's inexperience and credulity by insinuations equally false, plausible, and malicious, to which they at length gained his belief, by the mention of some circumstances that gave what they alleged an air of probability and even of truth. They swore that Mr. M. had taken out an action against him for a very large sum of money, that they had actually seen the writ, that the intention of it was to throw him into prison for life and ruin his cause, in consequence of an agreement made by him with Lord A. and his other enemies to retrieve the money that he had laid out in the cause. This plausible tale was enforced with such an air of truth, candour, and earnest concern for his safety, and was strengthened by so many imprecations and corroborating circumstances of their invention, as would have staggered one of much greater experience and knowledge of mankind than Mr. A. could be supposed at that time to possess. The notion of perpetual imprisonment, and the certain ruin they made him believe his cause was threatened with, worked upon his imagination to such a degree that he suffered himself to be led like a lamb to the slaughter by this artful band of villains, who secreted him at the lodgings of one P., an intimate of G's, for several days, under colour of his being hunted by bailiffs employed by Mr. M., where he was not only obliged by them to change his name, but even his wife was not suffered to have access to him. Their design was to have sold him, or drawn him into a ruinous compromise with his adversaries, for a valuable consideration to themselves. But as no ties are binding among such a knot of villains, the rest of the conspirators were jockeyed by G., who, in order to monopolize the advantage to himself, hurried his prize into the country, and secreted him even from his confederates in a place of concealment 100 miles from London, under the same ridiculous pretence of M.'s having taken out a writ against him, and of bailiffs being in pursuit of him everywhere round London. He was no sooner there than G., as a previous step to the other villainy he intended, tricked him out of a bond for £6,000, under colour of his having a person ready to advance the like sum upon it, as an immediate fund for carrying on his cause, assuring him at the same time that he had a set of gentlemen ready who were willing to advance £25,000 more for the same purpose, and to allow him £500 a year for his maintenance till his cause should be made an end of, provided that Mr. M. should have no further concern with him and his cause. Mr. A., having by this time received some intimations of the deceit that had been put upon him, made answer that he should look upon himself as a very ungrateful monster indeed, if he deserted a person who had saved his life, and so generously ventured his own, together with his fortune, in his cause, until he should first be certain of the truth of what was alleged of him, and absolutely rejected the proposal. G., who had no other view in making it than to cover the secret villainy he meditated against him, and to facilitate the execution thereof, easily receded from it when he found Mr. A. so averse to it, and undertook nevertheless to raise the money, adding that he might, if he pleased, return to Mr. M. whenever it was secured. The whole drift of this pretended undertaking to raise the £25,000 was only to lay a foundation for a dexterous contrivance to draw Mr. A. unwarily into the execution of a deed, relinquishing all his right and title, under a notion of its being a deed to secure the repayment of that sum. G., having, as he imagined, so far paved the way for the execution of such a deed, enters into an agreement with an agent employed for that purpose by Mr. A.'s adversaries, purporting that in consideration of the payment of a bond for £6,000, which he, G., had, as he pretended, laid out in Mr. A.'s cause, and of an annuity of £700 a year, he was to procure for them from Mr. A deed ready executed, relinquishing all right and title to the A estate and honours. Everything being prepared for the execution of this infernal scheme, known to Mr. A., G. then thought proper to send for him to town from his retirement, in order, as he pretended, to execute a security of £25,000. This intended victim to that villain's avarice no sooner arrived in town, full of hopes of money to carry on his cause, and of agreeably surprising his friend and protector Mr. M., with so seasonable and unexpected a reinforcement, that an unforeseen difficulty arose concerning the payment of G.'s £6,000 bond. That money was to have been raised out of the estate of a lunatic, which could not be done without the leave of the Court of Chancery, to whom an account must have been given of the intended application of it. While preparations were making to rectify this omission, G. immediately carried Mr. A. again into the country, lest he should happen to be undeceived by some means or other. In the meantime, this wicked machination was providentially discovered by Mr. M. before it could be carried into execution, by means of the jealousies that arose among the conspirators themselves, and was at the same time confirmed to him by a person whom the very agent for the A party had entrusted with the secret. M. no sooner detected it than he communicated his discovery to one of Mr. A.'s counsel, a man of great worth, and immediately thereupon took proper measures to defeat it. He then found means to lay open to Mr. A. himself the treacherous scheme that was laid for his destruction. He was highly sensible of it, and could never afterwards reflect on the snare that he had so unwarily been drawn into, and had so narrowly escaped, without a mixture of horror, shame, and gratitude to his deliverer. The consummate assurance of the monsters who were engaged in this plot, after they had been detected and upbraided with their treachery, is scarce to be paralleled, for they not only owned the fact of spiriting Mr. A. away in the manner above mentioned, but justified their doing it as tending to his service. They also maintained that they had actually secured the £25,000 for him, though they never could name any one person who was to have advanced the money. No man was more active in this scheme than H., nor any man more solicitous to keep Mr. A. up in the false impressions he had received, or in projecting methods to ruin his protector, than he. Among many other expedients for that purpose, a most malicious attempt was made to lodge an information against him for treasonable practices with the Secretary of State, notwithstanding the repeated proofs he had given of his loyalty; and as a preparatory step to his accusation, a letter which this traitor dictated was copied by another person and actually sent to the Earl of C., importing that the person who copied the letter had an affair of consequence to communicate to his lordship, if he would appoint a time of receiving the information. But that person, upon full conviction of the villainy of the scheme, absolutely refused to proceed further in it, so that his malice once more proved abortive, and before he had time to execute any other contrivance of the same nature, he was imprisoned in this very jail for debt. Here, finding his creditors inexorable, and himself destitute of all other resource, he made application to the very man whom he had injured in such an outrageous manner, set forth his deplorable case in the most pathetic terms, and entreated him, with the most abject humility, to use his influence in his behalf. The distress of this varlet immediately disarmed him of his resentment, and even excited his compassion. Without sending any answer to his remonstrances, he interceded for him with his creditors and the person to whom he was chiefly indebted. Refusing to release him without security, this unwearied benefactor joined with the prisoner in a bond for above £240, for which he obtained his release. He was no sooner discharged, however, than he entered into fresh combinations with G. and others in order to thwart his deliverer in his schemes of raising money, and otherwise to distress and deprive him of liberty; for which purpose no art or industry, perjury not excepted, hath been spared. And, what is still more extraordinary, this perfidious monster, having found money to take up the bond, in consequence of which he regained his freedom, hath procured a writ against him upon that very obligation, and taken assignments to some other debts of that gentleman with the same Christian intention. But hitherto he hath by surprising sagacity and unshaken resolution baffled all their infernal contrivances, and retorted some of their machinations on their own heads. At this time, when he is supposed by some, and represented by others, as under the circumstances of oblivion and despondence, he proceeds in his design with the utmost calmness and intrepidity, meditating schemes and ripening measures that will one day confound his enemies and attract the notice and admiration of mankind. Peregrine, having thanked the priest for his obliging information, expressed his surprise at the scandalous inattention of the world to an affair of such importance, observing that by such inhuman neglect this unfortunate young gentleman, Mr. A., was absolutely deprived of all the benefit of society, the sole end of which is to protect the rights, redress the grievances, and promote the happiness of individuals. As for the character of him, he said it was so romantically singular in all its circumstances, that though other motives were wanting, curiosity alone would induce him to seek his acquaintance. But he did not at all wonder at the ungrateful returns which had been made to his generosity by H. and many others, whom he had served in a manner that few besides himself would have done, for he had been long convinced of the truth conveyed in these lines of a celebrated Italian author: Li benefici che per la loro grandezza non possono essere guadagnati con la scellerata moneta dell'ingratitudine sono pagati. The story which you have related of that young gentleman, said he, bears a very strong resemblance to the fate of a Spanish nobleman, as it was communicated to me by one of his intimate friends at Paris. The Countess d'Alvarez died immediately after the birth of a son, and the husband surviving her but 3 years, the child was left sole heir to the honours and estate under the guardianship of his uncle, who had a small fortune and a great many children. This inhuman relation, coveting the wealth of his infant ward, formed a design against the life of the helpless orphan, and trusted the execution of it to his valet de chambre, who was tempted to undertake the murder by the promise of a considerable reward. He accordingly stabbed the boy with a knife in 3 different places on the right side of his neck, but as he was not used to such barbarous attempts, his hand failed in the performance, and he was seized with such remorse that, perceiving the wounds were not mortal, he carried the hapless victim to the house of a surgeon by whose care they were healed, and in the meantime, that he might not forfeit his recompense, found means to persuade his employer that his orders were performed. A bundle being made up for the purpose was publicly interred as the body of the child, who was said to have been suddenly carried off by convulsion, and the uncle without opposition succeeded to his honours and estate. The boy, being cured of his hurts, was, about the age of 6, delivered with a small sum of money to a merchant just embarking for Turkey, who was given to understand that he was the bastard of a man of quality, and that for family reasons it was necessary to conceal his birth. While the unfortunate orphan remained in this deplorable state of bondage, all the children of the usurper died one after another, and he himself, being taken dangerously ill, attributed all his afflictions to the just judgment of God, and communicated his anxiety on that subject to the valet de chambre who had been employed in the murder of his nephew. That domestic, in order to quiet his master's conscience and calm the perturbation of his spirits, confessed what he had done, and gave him hopes of still finding the boy by dint of industry and expense. The unhappy child being the only hope of the family of Alvarez, the uncle immediately ordered a minute inquiry to be set on foot, in consequence of which he was informed that the orphan had been sold to a Turk, who had afterwards transferred him to an English merchant, by whom he was conveyed to London. An express was immediately dispatched to this capital, where he understood that the unhappy exile had, in consideration of his faithful services, been bound apprentice to a French barber surgeon, and after he had sufficiently qualified himself in that profession, been received into the family of the Count de Galles, at that time the Emperor's ambassador at the court of London. From the house of this nobleman he was traced into the service of Count d'Oberstdorf, where he had married his lady's chambermaid, and then gone to settle as a surgeon in Bohemia. In the course of these inquiries several years elapsed. His uncle, who was very much attached to the house of Austria, lived at Barcelona, when the father of this Empress Queen resided in that city, and lent him a very considerable sum of money in the most pressing emergency of his affairs, and when that prince was on the point of returning to Germany, the old count, finding his end approaching, sent his father confessor to his majesty with a circumstantial account of the barbarity he had practised against his nephew, for which he implored forgiveness, and begged he would give orders that the orphan, when found, should inherit the dignities and fortune which he had unjustly usurped. His majesty assured the old man that he might make himself easy on that score, and ordered the confessor to follow him to Vienna immediately after the count's death, in order to assist his endeavours in finding out the injured heir. The priest did not fail to yield obedience to this command. He informed himself of certain natural marks on the young count's body, which were known to the nurse and women who attended him in his infancy, and with a gentleman whom the emperor ordered to accompany him, set out for Bohemia, where he soon found the object of his inquiry, in the capacity of major domo to a nobleman of that country, he having quitted his profession of surgery for that office. He was not a little surprised when he found himself circumstantially catechised about the particulars of his life by persons commissioned for that purpose by the emperor. He told them that he was absolutely ignorant of his own birth, though he had been informed during his residence in Turkey that he was the bastard of a Spanish grandee, and gave them a minute detail of the pilgrimage he had undergone. This information agreeing with the intelligence which the priest had already received, and being corroborated by the marks upon his body, and the very scars of the wounds which had been inflicted upon him in his infancy, the confessor, without further hesitation, saluted him by the name of Count d'Alvarez, grandee of Spain, and explained the whole mystery of his fortune. If he was agreeably amazed at this explanation, the case was otherwise with his wife, who thought herself in great danger of being abandoned by a husband of such high rank, but he immediately dispelled her apprehension by assuring her that as she had shared in his adversity, she should also partake of his good fortune. He set out immediately for Vienna, to make his acknowledgments to the Emperor, who favored him with a very gracious reception, promised to use his influence so that he might enjoy the honors and estate of his family, and in the meantime acknowledged himself his debtor for 400,000 florins, which he had borrowed from his uncle. He threw himself at the feet of his august protector, expressed the most grateful sense of his goodness, and begged he might be permitted to settle in some of his Imperial Majesty's dominions. This request was immediately granted. He was allowed to purchase land in any part of the hereditary dominions of the House of Austria to the amount of the sum I have mentioned, and made choice of the country of Ratibor and Silesia, where in all probability he still resides. Peregrine had scarce finished the narrative when he perceived Mr. M. slip something into the hand of the young man with whom he had been conversing at the other end of the room, and rise up from the table in order to take his leave. He at once understood the meaning of this conveyance, and longed for an opportunity to be acquainted with such a rare instance of primitive benevolence, but the consciousness of his present situation hindered him from making any advance that might be construed into forwardness or presumption. End of Chapter 98, Part 5. Chapter 99 of the Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 2, by Tobias Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 99. He is surprised with the appearance of Hatchway and Pipes, who take up their habitation in his neighborhood, contrary to his inclination and expressed desire. Being now regularly initiated in the mysteries of the fleet, and reconciled in some measure to the customs of the place, he began to bear the edge of reflection without wincing, and thinking it would be highly imprudent in him to defer any longer the purposes by which only he could enjoy any ease and satisfaction in his confinement, he resolved to resume his task of translating, and every week compose an occasional paper by way of revenge upon the minister, against whom he had denounced eternal war. With this view he locked himself up in his chamber, and went to work with great eagerness and application, when he was interrupted by a ticket porter, who, putting a letter in his hand, vanished in a moment before he had time to peruse the contents. Our hero, opening the billet, was not a little surprised to find a bank note for £50 enclosed in a blank sheet of paper, and having exercised his memory and penetration on the subject of this unexpected windfall, had just concluded that it could come from no other hand than the lady who had so kindly visited him a few days before, when his ears were suddenly invaded by the well-known sound of that whistle which always hung about the neck of Pipes as a memorial of his former occupation. This tune being performed, he heard the noise of a wooden leg ascending the stair, upon which he opened his door, and beheld his friend Hatchway, with his old shipmate at his back. After a cordial shake of the hand, with the usual salutation of "What cheer, cousin Pickle?" honest Jack seated himself without ceremony, and casting his eyes around the apartment, "Split my top staysail," said he, with an arch sneer. "You have got into a snug berth, cousin. Here you may sit all weathers, without being turned out to take your watch, and no fear of the ship's dragging her anchor. You ha'n't much room to spare, 'tis true, and I had known as how you stowed so close, Tom should have slung my own hammock for you, and then you mought have knocked down this great lubberly hurricane house. But mayhap you turn in double, and so you don't choose to trust yourself and your doxy to a clew and canvas." Pickle bore his jokes with great good humour, rallied him in his turn about the dairymaid at the garrison, inquiring about his friends in the country, asked if he had been to visit his niece, and finally expressed a desire of knowing the cause of his journey to London. The lieutenant satisfied his curiosity in all these particulars, and in answer to the last question observed that, from the information of Pipes, understanding he was landlocked, he had come from the country in order to tow him into the offing. "I know not how the wind sets," said he, But if so be as £3,000 will bring you clear of the Cape, say the word, and you shan't lie wind-bound another glass for want of the money." This was an offer which few people in our hero's situation would have altogether refused, especially as he had all the reason in the world to believe that, far from being a vain, unmeaning compliment, it was the genuine tribute of friendship, which the lieutenant would have willingly, ay, and with pleasure paid. Nevertheless, Peregrine peremptorily refused his assistance, though not without expressing himself in terms of acknowledgment suitable to the occasion. He told him it would be time enough to make use of his generosity when he should find himself destitute of all other resource. Jack employed all his rhetoric with a view of persuading him to take this opportunity to procure his own enlargement, and finding his arguments ineffectual, insisted upon his accepting an immediate supply for his necessary occasions, swearing with great vehemence that he would never return to the garrison unless he would put him upon the footing of any other tenant, and receive his rent accordingly. Our young gentleman as positively swore that he never would consider him in that light, remonstrating that he had long ago settled the house upon him for life as a pledge of his own esteem, as well as in conformity with the Commodore's desire; and beseeching him to return to his usual avocations, protested that if ever his situation should subject him to the necessity of borrowing from his friends, Mr. Hatchway should be the first man to whom he would apply himself for succor. To convince him that this was not the case at present, he produced the bank note which he had received in the letter, together with his own ready money, and mentioned some other funds which he invented extempore in order to amuse the lieutenant's concern. In the close of this expostulation he desired Pipes to conduct Mr. Hatchway to the coffee house, where he might amuse himself with the newspaper for half an hour, during which he would put on his clothes and bespeak something for dinner, that they might enjoy each other's company as long as his occasions would permit him to stay in that place. The two sailors were no sooner gone than he took up the pen and wrote the following letter, in which he enclosed the bank note to his generous benefactress. "Madam, your humanity is not more ingenious than my suspicion. In vain you attempt to impose upon me by an act of generosity which no person on earth but your ladyship is capable of committing. Though your name was not subscribed on the paper, your sentiments were fully displayed in the contents, which I must beg leave to restore with the same sense of gratitude, and for the same reasons I expressed when last I had the honor to converse with you upon this subject. Though I am deprived of my liberty by the villainy and ingratitude of mankind, I am not yet destitute of the other conveniences of life, and therefore beg to be excused for incurring an unnecessary addition to that load of obligation you have already laid upon, Madam, your ladyship's most devoted humble servant, Peregrine Pickle." Having dressed himself and repaired to the place of appointment, he dispatched this epistle by the hands of Pipes, who was ordered to leave it at her ladyship's house, without staying for an answer, and in the meantime gave directions for dinner, which he and his friend Hatchway ate very cheerfully in his own apartment, after he had entertained him with a sight of all the curiosities in the place. During their repast, Jack repeated his kind offers to our adventurer, who declined them with his former obstinacy, and begged he might be no more importuned on that subject; but if he insisted upon giving some fresh proofs of his friendship, he might have an opportunity of exhibiting it in taking Pipes under his care and protection, for nothing affected him so much as his inability to provide for such a faithful adherent. The lieutenant desired he would give himself no trouble upon that score, he being of his own accord perfectly well disposed to befriend his old shipmate, who should never want while he had a shilling to spare. But he began to drop some hints of an intention to fix his quarters in the fleet, observing that the air seemed to be very good in that place, and that he was tired of living in the country. What he said did not amount to a plain declaration, and therefore Peregrine did not answer it as such, though he perceived his drift, and took an opportunity of describing the inconveniences of the place, in such a manner as, he hoped, would deter him from putting such an extravagant plan in execution. This expedient, however, far from answering the end proposed, had a quite contrary effect, and furnished Hatchway with an argument against his own unwillingness to quit such a disagreeable place. In all probability, Jack would have been more explicit with regard to the scheme he had proposed, if the conversation had not been interrupted by the arrival of Cadwallader, who never failed in the performance of his diurnal visit. Hatchway, conjecturing that this stranger might have some private business with his friend, quitted the apartment on pretence of taking a turn, and meeting Pipes at the door, desired his company to the Bear, by which name the open space is distinguished, where, during a course of perambulation, these two companions held a council upon Pickle, in consequence of which it was determined, since he obstinately persisted to refuse their assistance, that they should take lodgings in his neighbourhood, with a view of being at hand to minister unto his occasions, in spite of his false delicacy, according to the emergency of his affairs. This resolution being taken, they consulted the barkeeper of the coffee house about lodging, and she directed them to the warden, to whom the lieutenant, in his great wisdom, represented himself as a kinsman to Peregrine, who, rather than leave that young gentleman by himself to the unavoidable discomforts of a prison, was inclined to keep him company till such time as his affairs could be put in order. This measure he the more anxiously desired to take, because the prisoner was sometimes subject to a disordered imagination, upon which occasion he stood in need of extraordinary attendance, and therefore he, the lieutenant, entreated the warden to accommodate him with a lodging for himself and his servant, for which he was ready to make any reasonable acknowledgment. The warden, who was a sensible and humane man, could not help applauding his resolution, and several rooms being at that time unoccupied, he put him immediately in possession of a couple, which were forthwith prepared for his reception. This affair being settled to his satisfaction, he dispatched Pipes for his portmanteau, and returning to the coffee house, found Peregrine, with whom he spent the remaining part of the evening. Our hero, taking it for granted that he proposed to set out for the garrison next day, wrote a memorandum of some books which he had left in that habitation, and which he now desired Jack to send up to town by the wagon directed for Mr. Crabtree. He cautioned him against giving the least hint of his misfortune in the neighbourhood, that it might remain as long as possible concealed from the knowledge of his sister, who he knew would afflict herself immoderately at the news, nor reach the ears of the rest of his family, who would exult and triumph over his distress. Hatchway listened to his injunctions with great attention, and promised to demean himself accordingly. Then the discourse shifted to an agreeable recapitulation of the merry scenes they had formerly acted together, and the evening being pretty far advanced, Peregrine, with seeming reluctance, told him that the gates of the Fleet would in a few minutes be shut for the night, and that there was an absolute necessity for his withdrawing to his lodging. Jack replied that he could not think of parting with him so soon, after such a long separation, and that he was determined to stay with him an hour or two longer, if he should be obliged to take up his lodging in the streets. Pickle, rather than disoblige his guest, indulged him in his desire, and resolved to give him a share of his own bed. A pair of chickens and asparagus were bespoke for supper, at which Pipes attended with an air of internal satisfaction, and the bottle was bandied about in a jovial manner till midnight, when the lieutenant rose up to take his leave, observing that, being fatigued with riding, he was inclined to turn in. Pipes, upon this intimation, produced a lanthorn ready lighted, and Jack, shaking his entertainer by the hand, wished him good night, and promised to visit him again betimes in the morning. Peregrine, imagining that his behaviour proceeded from the wine which he had plentifully drunk, told him that if he was disposed to sleep, his bed was ready prepared in the room, and ordered his attendant to undress his master, upon which Mr. Hatchway gave him to understand that he had no occasion to incommode his friend, having already provided a lodging for himself, and the young gentleman demanding an explanation, he frankly owned what he had done, saying, "You gave me such a dismal account of the place, that I could not think of leaving you in it without company." Our young gentleman, who was naturally impatient of benefits, and foresaw that this uncommon instance of Hatchway's friendship would encroach upon the plan which he had formed for his own subsistence, by engrossing his time and attention, so as that he should not be able to prosecute his labors, closeted the lieutenant next day, and demonstrated to him the folly and ill consequences of the step he had taken. He observed that the world in general would look upon it as the effect of mere madness, and if his relations were so disposed, they might make it the foundation for a statute of lunacy against him; that his absence from the garrison must be a very great detriment to his private affairs; and lastly, that his presence in the fleet would be a very great hindrance to Pickle himself, whose hope of regaining his liberty altogether depended upon his being detached from all company and interruption. To these remonstrances Jack replied, that as to the opinion of the world, it was no more to him than a rotten net-line, and if his relations had a mind to have his upper works condemned, he did not doubt but he should be able to stand the survey without being declared unfit for service; that he had no affairs at the garrison but such as would keep cold; and with regard to Pickle's being interrupted by his presence, he gave him his word that he would never come alongside of him except when he should give him the signal for holding discourse. In conclusion, he signified his resolution to stay where he was, at all events, without making himself accountable to any person whatsoever. Peregrine, seeing him determined, desisted from any further importunity, resolving, however, to tire him out of his plan by reserve and supercilious neglect, for he could not bear the thought of being so notoriously obliged by any person upon earth. With this view he quitted the lieutenant upon some slight pretence, after having told him that he could not have the pleasure of his company at dinner, because he was engaged with a particular club of his fellow prisoners. Jack was a stranger to the punctilios of behaviour, and therefore did not take this declaration amiss, but had immediate recourse to the advice of his counsellor, Mr. Pipes, who proposed that he should go to the coffee house and kitchen, and give the people to understand that he would pay for all such liquor and provisions as Mr. Pickle should order to be sent to his lodging. This expedient was immediately practised, and as there was no credit in the place, Hatchway deposited a sum of money by way of security to the cook and the vintner, intimating that there was a necessity for taking that method of befriending his cousin Peregrine, who was subject to strange whims that rendered it impossible to serve him any other way. In consequence of these insinuations, it was that same day rumoured about the fleet that Mr. Pickle was an unhappy gentleman, disordered in his understanding, and that the lieutenant was his near relation, who had subjected himself to the inconvenience of living in a jail, with the sole view of keeping a strict eye over his conduct. This report, however, did not reach the ears of our hero till the next day, when he sent one of the runners of the fleet, who attended him, to bespeak and pay for a couple of pullets and something else for dinner, to which he had already invited his friend Hatchway, in hope of being able to persuade him to retire into the country, after he had undergone a whole day's mortification in the place. The messenger returned with an assurance that the dinner should be made ready according to his directions, and restored the money, observing that his kinsman had paid for what was bespoke. Peregrine was equally surprised and disgusted at this information, and resolved to chide the lieutenant severely for his unseasonable treat, which he considered as a thing repugnant to his reputation. Meanwhile he dispatched his attendant for wine to the coffee house, and finding his credit bolstered up in that place by the same means, was enraged at the presumption of Jack's friendship. He questioned the valet about it with such manifestation of displeasure, that the fellow, afraid of disobliging such a good master, frankly communicated the story which was circulated at his expense. The young gentleman was so much incensed at this piece of intelligence, that he wrote a bitter expostulation to the lieutenant, where he not only retracted his invitation, but declared that he would never converse with him while he should remain within the place. Having thus obeyed the dictates of his anger, he gave notice to the cook that he should not have occasion for what was ordered. Repairing to the coffee house, he told the landlord that whereas he understood the stranger with the wooden leg had prepossessed him and others with ridiculous notions tending to bring the sanity of his intellects in question, and to confirm this imputation, had, under the pretence of consanguinity, undertaken to defray his expenses, he could not help, in justice to himself, declaring that the same person was, in reality, the madman who had given his keepers the slip; that therefore he, the landlord, would not find his account in complying with his orders and encouraging him to frequent his house, and that for his own part he would never enter the door, or favour him with the least trifle of his custom, if ever he should for the future find himself anticipated in his payments by that unhappy lunatic. The vintner was confounded at this retorted charge, and after much perplexity and deliberation concluded that both parties were distracted, the stranger in paying a man's debts against his will, and Pickle in being offended at such forwardness of friendship. Chapter 99. Chapter 100 of The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 2, by Tobias Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 100. These associates commit an assault upon Crabtree, for which they are banished from the fleet. Peregrine begins to feel the effects of confinement. Our adventurer, having dined at an ordinary, and in the afternoon retired to his own apartment as usual, with his friend Cadwallader, Hatchway and his associate, after they had been obliged to discuss the provision for which they had paid, renewed their conference upon the old subject, Pipes giving his messmate to understand that Peregrine's chief confidant was the old deaf bachelor, whom he had seen at his lodging the preceding day. Mr. Hatchway, in his great penetration, discovered that the young gentleman's obstinacy proceeded from the advice of the misanthrope, whom, for that reason, it was their business to chastise. Pipes entered into this opinion the more willingly, as he had all along believed the senior to be a sort of wizard, or some cacodemon, whom it was not very creditable to be acquainted with. Indeed, he had been inspired with this notion by the insinuations of Hadgee, who had formerly dropped some hints touching Crabtree's profound knowledge in the magic art, mentioning in particular his being possessed of the philosopher's stone, an assertion to which Tom had given implicit credit, until his master was sent to prison for debt, when he could no longer suppose Cadwallader lord of such a valuable secret, or else he would have certainly procured the enlargement of his most intimate friend. With these sentiments he espoused the resentment of Hatchway. They determined to seize the supposed conjurer with the first opportunity, on his return from his visit to Peregrine, and without hesitation exercise upon him the discipline of the pump. This plan they would have executed that same evening, had not the misanthrope luckily withdrawn himself by accident before it was dark, and even before they had intelligence of his retreat. But next day they kept themselves upon the watch till he appeared, and Pipes lifting his hat as Crabtree passed, "Oh, durn ye, old Dunny," said he, "you and I must grapple by and by. And egad, I shall lie so near your quarter that your ear ports will let in the sound, though they are double caulked with oakum." This misanthrope's ears were not quite so fast closed, but that they received this intimation, which, though delivered in terms that he did not well understand, had such an effect upon his apprehension, that he signified his doubts to Peregrine, observing that he did not much like the looks of that same ruffian with the wooden leg. Pickle assured him he had nothing to fear from the two sailors, who could have no cause of resentment against him, or if they had, would not venture to take any step which they knew must block up all the avenues to that reconcilement about which they were so anxious, and moreover give such offence to the governor of the place as would infallibly induce him to expel them both from his territories. Notwithstanding this assurance, the young gentleman was not so confident of the lieutenant's discretion as to believe that Crabtree's fears were altogether without foundation. He forthwith conjectured that Jack had taken umbrage at an intimacy from which he found himself excluded, and imputed his disgrace to the insinuations of Cadwallader, whom, in all likelihood, he intended to punish for his supposed advice. He knew his friend could sustain no great damage from the lieutenant's resentment in a place which he could immediately alarm with his cries, and therefore wished he might fall into the snare, because it would furnish him with a pretence of complaint, in consequence of which the sailors would be obliged to shift their quarters, so as that he should be rid of their company, in which he at present could find no enjoyment. Everything happened as he had foreseen. The misanthrope, in his retreat from Peregrine's chamber, was assaulted by Hatchway and his associate, who seized him by the collar without ceremony, and began to drag him towards the pump, at which they would have certainly complimented him with a very disagreeable bath, had not he exalted his voice in such a manner as in a moment brought a number of the inhabitants and Pickle himself to his aid. The assailants would have persisted in their design, had the opposition been such as they could have faced with any possibility of success, nor did they quit their prey before a dozen, at least, had come to his rescue, and Peregrine, with a menacing aspect and air of authority, commanded his old valet to withdraw. Then they thought proper to sheer off, and betake themselves to close quarters, while our hero accompanied the affrighted Cadwallader to the gate, and exhibited to the warden a formal complaint against the rioters, upon whom he retorted the charge of lunacy, which was supported by the evidence of 20 persons who had been eyewitnesses of the outrage committed against the old gentleman. The governor, in consequence of this information, sent a message to Mr. Hatchway, warning him to move his lodging next day, on pain of being expelled. The lieutenant, contumaciously refusing to comply with this intimation, was in the morning, while he amused himself in walking upon the Bear, suddenly surrounded by the constables of the court, who took him and his adherent prisoners before they were aware, and delivered them into the hands of the turnkeys, by whom they were immediately dismissed, and their baggage conveyed to the side of the ditch. This expulsion was not performed without an obstinate opposition on the part of the delinquents, who, had they not been surprised, would have set the whole fleet at defiance, and in all probability have acted divers tragedies before they could have been overpowered. Things being circumstanced as they were, the lieutenant did not part with his conductor without tweaking his nose, by way of farewell, and Pipes, in imitation of such a laudable example, communicated a token of remembrance in an application to the sole eye of his attendant, who, scorning to be outdone in this kind of courtesy, returned the compliment with such goodwill, that Tom's organ performed the office of a multiplying glass. These were mutual hints for stripping, and accordingly each was naked from the waist upwards in a trice. A ring of butchers from the market was immediately formed. A couple of the Reverend Flammonds, who in morning gowns ply for marriages in that quarter of the town, constituted themselves seconds and umpires of the approaching contest, and the battle began without further preparation. The combatants were, in point of strength and agility, pretty equally matched, but the jailer had been regularly trained in the art of bruising. He had more than once signalized himself in public by his prowess and skill in this exercise, and lost one eye upon the stage in the course of his exploits. This was a misfortune of which Pipes did not fail to take the advantage. He had already sustained several hard knocks upon his temples and jaws, and found it impracticable to smite his antagonist upon the victualling office, so dexterously was it defended against assault. He then changed his battery, and being ambidexter, raised such a clatter upon the turnkey's blind side, that this hero, believing him left-handed, converted his attention that way, and opposed the unenlightened side of his face to the right hand of Pipes, which being thus unprovided against, slyly bestowed upon him a peg under the fifth rib, that in an instant laid him senseless on the pavement, at the feet of his conqueror. Pipes was congratulated upon his victory, not only by his friend Hatchway, but also by all the bystanders, particularly the priest who had espoused his cause, and now invited the strangers to his lodgings in a neighbouring alehouse, where they were entertained so much to their liking that they determined to seek no other habitation while they should continue in town, and notwithstanding the disgrace and discouragement they had met with in their endeavours to serve our adventurer, they were still resolved to persevere in their good offices, or, in the vulgar phrase, to see him out. While they settled themselves in this manner, and acquired familiar connections round all the purlieus of the ditch, Peregrine found himself deprived of the company of Cadwallader, who signified by letter that he did not choose to hazard his person again in visiting him while such assassins occupied the avenues through which he must pass; for he had been at pains to inquire into the motions of the seamen, and informed himself exactly of the harbour in which they were moored. Our hero had been so much accustomed to the conversation of Crabtree, which was altogether suitable to the singularity of his own disposition, that he could very ill afford to be debarred of it at this juncture, when almost every other source of enjoyment was stopped. He was, however, obliged to submit to the hardship of his situation, and as the characters of his fellow prisoners did not at all improve upon him, he was compelled to seek for satisfaction within himself; not but that he had an opportunity of conversing with some people who neither wanted sense nor were deficient in point of principle, yet there appeared in the behaviour of them all, without exception, a certain want of decorum, a squalor of sentiment, a sort of jailish cast, contracted in the course of confinement, which disgusted the delicacy of our hero's observation. He therefore detached himself from their parties as much as he could, without giving offence to those among whom he was obliged to live, and resumed his labours with incredible eagerness and perseverance, his spirits being supported by the success of some severe philippics, which he occasionally published against the author of his misfortune. Nor was his humanity unemployed in the vacations of his revenge. A man must be void of all sympathy and compassion who can reside among so many miserable objects without feeling an inclination to relieve their distress. Every day almost presented to his view such lamentable scenes as were most likely to attract his notice and engage his benevolence. Reverses of fortune, attended with the most deplorable circumstances of domestic woe, were continually intruding upon his acquaintance. His ears were invaded with the cries of the hapless wife, who from the enjoyment of affluence and pleasure was forced to follow her husband to this abode of wretchedness and want. His eyes were every minute assailed with the naked and meagre appearances of hunger and cold, and his fancy teemed with 1,000 aggravations of their misery. Thus situated, his purse was never shut, while his heart remained open. Without reflecting upon the slenderness of his store, he exercised his charity to all the children of distress, and acquired a popularity which, though pleasing, was far from being profitable. In short, his bounty kept no pace with his circumstances, and in a little time he was utterly exhausted. He had recourse to his bookseller, from whom, with great difficulty, he obtained a small reinforcement, and immediately relapsed into the same want of retention. He was conscious of his infirmity, and found it incurable. He foresaw that by his own industry he should never be able to defray the expense of these occasions, and this reflection sunk deep into his mind. The approbation of the public, which he had earned, or might acquire like a cordial, often repeated, began to lose its effect upon his imagination. His health suffered by his sedentary life and austere application. His eyesight failed, his appetite forsook him, his spirits decayed, so that he became melancholy, listless, and altogether incapable of prosecuting the only means he had left for his subsistence; and what did not at all contribute to the alleviation of these particulars, he was given to understand by his lawyer that he had lost his cause, and was condemned in costs. Even this was not the most mortifying piece of intelligence he received. He at the same time learned that his bookseller was bankrupt, and his friend Crabtree at the point of death. These were comfortable considerations to a youth of Peregrine's disposition, which was so capricious that the more his misery increased, the more haughty and inflexible he became. Rather than be beholden to Hatchway, who still hovered about the gate, eager for an opportunity to assist him, he chose to undergo the want of almost every convenience of life, and actually pledged his wearing apparel to an Irish pawnbroker in the Fleet for money to purchase those things without which he must have absolutely perished. He was gradually irritated by his misfortunes into a rancorous resentment against mankind in general, and his heart so alienated from the enjoyments of life that he did not care how soon he quitted his miserable existence. Though he had shocking examples of the vicissitudes of fortune continually before his eyes, he could never be reconciled to the idea of living like his fellow sufferers in the most abject degree of dependence. If he refused to accept of favours from his own allies and intimate friends, whom he had formerly obliged, it is not to be supposed that he would listen to proposals of that kind from any of his fellow prisoners, with whom he had contracted acquaintance. He was even more cautious than ever of incurring obligations. He now shunned his former messmates in order to avoid disagreeable tenders of friendship. Imagining that he perceived an inclination in the clergyman to learn the state of his finances, he discouraged and declined the explanation, and at length secluded himself from all society. End of chapter 100. Chapter 101 of the Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 2, by Tobias Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 101. He receives an unexpected visit, and the clouds of misfortune begin to separate. While he pined in this forlorn condition, with an equal abhorrence of the world and himself, Captain Gauntlet arrived in town in order to employ his interest for promotion in the army, and in consequence of his wife's particular desire, made it his business to inquire for Peregrine, to whom he longed to be reconciled, even though at the expense of a slight submission. But he could hear no tidings of him at the place to which he was directed, and on the supposition that our hero had gone to reside in the country, applied himself to his own business, with intention to renew his inquiries after that affair should be transacted. He communicated his demands to his supposed patron, who had assumed the merit of making him a captain, and been gratified with a valuable present on that consideration, and was cajoled with hopes of succeeding in his present aim by the same interest. Meanwhile he became acquainted with one of the clerks belonging to the War Office, whose advice and assistance, he was told, would be of furtherance to his scheme. As he had occasion to discourse with this gentleman upon the circumstances of his expectation, he learned that the nobleman upon whom he depended was a person of no consequence in the state, and altogether incapable of assisting him in his advancement. At the same time his counsellor expressed his surprise that Captain Gauntlet did not rather interest in his cause the noble peer to whose good offices he owed his last commission. This remark introduced an explanation, by which Godfrey discovered to his infinite astonishment the mistake in which he had continued so long with regard to his patron, though he could not divine the motive which induced a nobleman with whom he had no acquaintance or connection to interpose his influence in his behalf. Whatsoever that might be, he thought it was his duty to make his acknowledgment, and for that purpose went next morning to his house, where he was politely received, and given to understand that Mr. Pickle was the person to whose friendship he was indebted for his last promotion. Inexpressible were the transports of gratitude, affection, and remorse that took possession of the soul of Gauntlet when this mystery was unfolded. "Good Heaven!" cried he, lifting up his hands. Have I lived so long in a state of animosity with my benefactor? I intended to have reconciled myself at any rate before I was sensible of this obligation, but now I shall not enjoy a moment's quiet until I have an opportunity of expressing to him my sense of his heroic friendship. I presume, from the nature of the favour conferred upon him in my behalf, that Mr. Pickle is well known to your lordship, and I should think myself extremely happy if you could inform me in what part of the country he is to be found, for the person with whom he lodged some time ago could give me no intelligence of his motions." The nobleman, touched with this instance of generous self-denial in Peregrine, as well as with the sensibility of his friend, lamented the unhappiness of our hero, while he gave Gauntlet to understand that he had been long disordered in his intellects in consequence of having squandered away his fortune, and that his creditors had thrown him into the Fleet Prison. But whether he still continued in that confinement, or was released from his misfortunes by death, his lordship did not know, because he had never inquired. Godfrey no sooner received this intimation than, his blood boiling with grief and impatience, he craved pardon for his abrupt departure, then quitting his informer on the instant, re-embarked in his hackney coach, and ordered himself to be conveyed directly to the Fleet. As the vehicle proceeded along one side of the market, he was surprised with the appearance of Hatchway and Pipes, who stood cheapening cauliflowers at a green stall, their heads being cased in worsted nightcaps, half covered with their hats, and a short tobacco pipe in the mouth of each. He was rejoiced at sight of the two seamen, which he took for a happy omen of finding his friend, and ordering the coachman to stop the carriage, called to the lieutenant by his name. Jack, replying with an "Hillo!" looking behind him, and recognizing the face of his old acquaintance, ran up to the coach with great eagerness. Shaking the captain heartily by the hand, "Odds heart," said he, "I'm glad thou hast fallen in with us. We shall now be able to find the trim of this vessel, and lay her about on t'other tack. For my own part, I have had many a consort in my time, that is, in the way of good fellowship, and I always made a shift to wear 'em at one time or another; but this headstrong toad will neither obey the helm nor the sheet, and for aught I know will founder where a lies at anchor." Gauntlet, who conceived part of his meaning, alighted immediately, and being conducted to the sailors' lodging, was informed of everything that had passed between the lieutenant and Pickle. He, in his turn, communicated to Jack the discovery which he had made with regard to his commission, at which the other gave no signs of surprise, but taking the pipe from his mouth, "Why, look ye, captain," said he, "that's not the only good turn you have owed him. That same money you received from the commodore as an old debt was all a sham contrived by Pickle for your service; but a wool drive under his bare poles, without sails and rigging, or a mess of provision on board, rather than take the same assistance from another man." Godfrey was not only amazed, but chagrined at the knowledge of this anecdote, which gave umbrage to his pride, while it stimulated his desire of doing something in return for the obligation. He inquired into the present circumstances of the prisoner, and understanding that he was indisposed, and but indifferently provided with the common necessaries of life, though still deaf to all offers of assistance, began to be extremely concerned at the account of this savage obstinacy and pride, which would, he feared, exclude him from the privilege of relieving him in his distress. However, he resolved to leave no expedient untried that might have any tendency to surmount such destructive prejudice, and entering the jail, was directed to the apartment of the wretched prisoner. He knocked softly at the door, and when it was opened, started back with horror and astonishment. The figure that presented itself to his view was the remains of his once happy friend, but so miserably altered and disguised that his features were scarce cognizable. The florid, the sprightly, the gay, the elevated youth was now metamorphosed into a wan, dejected, meagre, squalid spectre, the hollow-eyed representative of distemper, indigence, and despair. Yet his eyes retained a certain ferocity, which threw a dismal gleam athwart the cloudiness of his aspect, and he in silence viewed his old companion with a look betokening confusion and disdain. As for Gauntlet, he could not without emotion behold such a woeful reverse of fate in a person for whom he entertained the noblest sentiments of friendship, gratitude, and esteem. His sorrow was at first too big for utterance, and he shed a flood of tears before he could pronounce one word. Peregrine, in spite of his misanthropy, could not help being affected with this uncommon testimony of regard, but he strove to stifle his sensations. His brows contracted themselves into a severe frown. His eyes kindled into the appearance of live coals. He waved with his hand in signal for Godfrey to be gone, and leave such a wretch as him to the miseries of his fate, and finding nature too strong to be suppressed, uttered a deep groan, and wept aloud. The soldier, seeing him thus, melted, unable to restrain the strong impulse of his affection, sprung towards, and clasping him in his arms, "My dearest friend and best benefactor," said he, "I am come hither to humble myself for the offence I was so unhappy as to give at our last parting, to beg a reconciliation, to thank you for the case and affluence I have enjoyed through your means, and to rescue you, in spite of yourself, from this melancholy situation, of which, but an hour ago, I was utterly ignorant. Do not deny me the satisfaction of acquitting myself in point of duty and obligation. You must certainly have had some regard for a person in whose favour you have exerted yourself so much, and if any part of that esteem remains, you will not refuse him an opportunity of approving himself in some measure worthy of it. Let me not suffer the most mortifying of all repulses, that of slighted friendship, but kindly sacrifice your resentment and inflexibility to the request of one who is at all times ready to sacrifice his life for your honour and advantage. If you will not yield to my entreaties, have some regard to the wishes of my Sophy, who laid me under the strongest injunctions to solicit your forgiveness, even before she knew how much I was indebted to your generosity. Or if that consideration should be of no weight, I hope you will relax a little for the sake of poor Amelia, whose resentment hath been long subdued by her affection, and who now droops in secret at your neglect." Every word of this address, delivered in the most pathetic manner, made an impression upon the mind of Peregrine. He was affected with the submission of his friend, who in reality had given him no just cause to complain. He knew that no ordinary motive had swayed him to a condescension so extraordinary in a man of his punctilious temper. He considered it, therefore, as the genuine effect of eager gratitude and disinterested love, and his heart began to relent accordingly. When he heard himself conjured in the name of the gentle Sophy, his obstinacy was quite overcome, and when Amelia was recalled to his remembrance, his whole frame underwent a violent agitation. He took his friend by the hand with a softened look, and as soon as he recovered the faculty of speech, which had been overpowered in the conflict of passions that transported him, protested that he retained no vestige of animosity, but considered him in the light of an affectionate comrade, the ties of whose friendship adversity could not unbind. He mentioned Sophy in the most respectful terms, spoke of Amelia with the most reverential awe, as the object of his inviolable love and veneration, but disclaimed all hope of ever more attracting her regard, and excused himself from profiting by Godfrey's kind intention, declaring with a resolute air that he had broken off all connection with mankind, and that he impatiently longed for the hour of his dissolution, which, if it should not soon arrive by the course of nature, he was resolved to hasten with his own hands, rather than be exposed to the contempt and more intolerable pity of a rascally world. Gauntlet argued against this frantic determination with all the vehemence of expostulating friendship, but his remonstrances did not produce the desired effect upon our desperate hero, who calmly refuted all his arguments and asserted the rectitude of his design from the pretended maxims of reason and true philosophy. While this dispute was carried on with eagerness on one side and deliberation on the other, a letter was brought to Peregrine, who threw it carelessly aside unopened, though the superscription was in a handwriting to which he was a stranger, and in all probability the contents would never have been perused, had not Gauntlet insisted upon his waiving all ceremony and reading it forthwith. Thus solicited, Pickle unsealed the billet, which, to his no small surprise, contained the following intimation: "Sir, this comes to inform you that after many dangers and disappointments, I am, by the blessing of God, safely arrived in the Downs, on board of the Gambaroon Indiaman, having made a tolerable voyage, by which I hope I shall be enabled to repay, with interest, the £700 which I borrowed of you before my departure from England. I take this opportunity of writing by our purser, who goes express with dispatches for the company, that you may have this satisfactory notice as soon as possible, relating to one whom I suppose you have long given over as lost. I have enclosed it in a letter to my broker, who I hope knows your address, and will forward it accordingly. And I am, with respect, sir, your most humble servant, Benjamin Chintz." He had no sooner taken a cursory view of this agreeable epistle, than his countenance cleared up, and reaching it to his friend with a smile, "There," said he, "is a more convincing argument on your side of the question than all the casuists in the universe can advance." Gauntlet, wondering at this observation, took the paper, and casting his eyes greedily upon the contents, congratulated him upon the receipt of it, with extravagant demonstrations of joy. "Not on account of the sum," said he, "which, upon my honor, I would with pleasure pay 3 times over for your convenience and satisfaction, but because it seems to have reconciled you to life, and disposed your mind for enjoying the comforts of society." The instantaneous effect which this unexpected smile of fortune produced in the appearance of our adventurer is altogether inconceivable. It plumped up his cheeks in a moment, unbended and enlightened every feature of his face, elevated his head, which had begun to sink, as it were, between his shoulders, and from a squeaking, dispirited tone, swelled up his voice to a clear, manly accent. Godfrey, taking advantage of this favorable change, began to regale him with prospects of future success. He reminded him of his youth and qualifications, which were certainly designed for better days than those he had as yet seen. He pointed out various paths by which he might arrive at wealth and reputation. He importuned him to accept of a sum for his immediate occasions, and earnestly begged that he would allow him to discharge the debt for which he was confined, observing that Sophy's fortune had enabled him to exhibit that proof of his gratitude without any detriment to his affairs, and protesting that he should not believe himself in possession of Mr. Pickle's esteem, unless he was permitted to make some such return of good will to the man, who had not only raised him from indigence and scorn to competence and reputable rank, but also empowered him to obtain the possession of an excellent woman, who had filled up the measure of his felicity. Peregrine declared himself already overpaid for all his good offices by the pleasure he enjoyed in employing them, and the happy effects they had produced in the mutual satisfaction of 2 persons so dear to his affection, and assured his friend that one time or other he would set his conscience at ease, and remove the scruples of his honor by having recourse to his assistance, but at present he could not make use of his friendship without giving just cause of offence to honest Hatchway, who was prior to him in point of solicitation, and had manifested his attachment with surprising obstinacy and perseverance. End of chapter 101. Chapter 102 of The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 2, by Tobias Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 102. Peregrine reconciles himself to the lieutenant, and renews his connection with society. Divers plans are projected in his behalf, and he has occasion to exhibit a remarkable proof of self-denial. The captain, with reluctance, yielded the preference in this particular to Jack, who was immediately invited to a conference by a note subscribed with Pickle's own hand. He was found at the prison gate, waiting for Gauntlet to know the issue of his negotiation. He no sooner received this summons than he set all his sails and made the best of his way to his friend's apartment. Being admitted by the turnkey, in consequence of Peregrine's request, communicated by the messenger who carried the billet. Pipes followed close in the wake of his shipmate, and in a few minutes after the note had been dispatched, Peregrine and Gauntlet heard the sound of the stump ascending the wooden staircase with such velocity that they at first mistook it for the application of drumsticks to the head of an empty barrel. This uncommon speed, however, was attended with a misfortune. He chanced to overlook a small defect in one of the steps, and his prop plunging into a hole, he fell backwards to the imminent danger of his life. Tom was luckily at his back and sustained him in his arms, so as that he escaped without any other damage than the loss of his wooden leg, which was snapped in the middle by the weight of his body in falling. And such was his impatience that he would not give himself the trouble to disengage the fractured member. Unbuckling the whole equipage in a trice, he left it sticking in the crevice, saying a rotten cable was not worth heaving up, and in this natural state of mutilation hopped into the room with infinite expedition. Peregrine, taking him cordially by the hand, seated him upon one side of his bed, and after having made an apology for that reserve of which he had so justly complained, asked if he could conveniently accommodate him with the loan of 20 guineas. The lieutenant, without opening his mouth, pulled out his purse, and Pipes, who overheard the demand, applying the whistle to his lips, performed a loud overture in token of his joy. Matters being thus brought to an accommodation, our hero told the captain that he should be glad of his company at dinner with their common friend Hatchway, if he would in the meantime leave him to the ministry of Pipes, and the soldier went away for the present in order to pay a short visit to his uncle, who at that time languished in a declining state of health, promising to return at the appointed hour. The lieutenant, having surveyed the dismal appearance of his friend, could not help being moved at the spectacle, and began to upbraid him with his obstinate pride, which he swore was no better than self-murder. But the young gentleman interrupted him in the course of his moralizing by telling him he had reasons for his conduct, which perhaps he would impart in due season, but at present his design was to alter that plan of behaviour and make himself some amends for the misery he had undergone. He accordingly sent Pipes to redeem his clothes from the pawnbroker's wardrobe, and bespeak something comfortable for dinner. When Godfrey came back, he was very agreeably surprised to see such a favourable alteration in his externals, for by the assistance of his valet he had purified himself from the dregs of his distress, and now appeared in a decent suit, with clean linen, while his face was disencumbered of the hair that overshadowed it, and his apartment prepared for the reception of company. They enjoyed their meal with great satisfaction, entertaining one another with a recapitulation of their former adventures at the garrison. In the afternoon, Gauntlet, taking his leave, in order to write a letter to his sister, at the desire of his uncle, who, finding his end approaching, wanted to see her without loss of time, Peregrine made his appearance on the Bear, and was complimented on his coming abroad again, not only by his old messmates, who had not seen him for many weeks, but by a number of those objects whom his liberality had fed, before his funds were exhausted. Hatchway was, by his interest with the warden, put in possession of his former quarters, and Pipes dispatched to make inquiry about Crabtree at his former lodging, where he learned that the misanthrope, after a very severe fit of illness, was removed to Kensington gravel pits, for the convenience of breathing a purer air than that of London. In consequence of this information, Peregrine, who knew the narrowness of the old gentleman's fortune, next day desired his friend Gauntlet to take the trouble of visiting him in his name with a letter, in which he expressed great concern for his indisposition, gave him notice of the fortunate intelligence he had received from the Downs, and conjured him to make use of his purse if he was in the least hampered in his circumstances. The captain took coach immediately, and set out for the place, according to the direction which Pipes had procured. Cadwallader, having seen him at Bath, knew him again at first sight, and though reduced to a skeleton, believed himself in such a fair way of doing well, that he would have accompanied him to the Fleet immediately, had he not been restrained by his nurse, who was by his physician invested with full authority to dispute and oppose his will in everything that she should think prejudicial to his health. For he was considered by those who had the care of him as an old humorist, not a little distempered in his brain. He inquired particularly about the sailors who, he said, had deterred him from carrying on his usual correspondence with Pickle, and been the immediate cause of his indisposition, by terrifying him into a fever. Understanding that the breach between Pickle and Hatchway was happily cemented, and that he was no longer in any danger from the lieutenant's resentment, he promised to be at the Fleet with the first convenient opportunity, and in the meantime wrote an answer to Peregrine's letter, importing that he was obliged to him for his offer, but had not the least occasion for his assistance. In a few days our adventurer recovered his vigour, complexion, and vivacity. He mingled again in the diversions and parties of the place, and he received in a little time the money he had lent upon Bottomry, which, together with the interest, amounted to upwards of £1100. The possession of this sum, while it buoyed up his spirits, involved him in perplexity. Sometimes he thought it was incumbent on him, as a man of honour, to employ the greatest part of it in diminishing the debt for which he suffered. On the other hand, he considered that obligation effaced by the treacherous behaviour of his creditor, who had injured him to 10 times the value of the sum; and in these sentiments entertained thoughts of attempting his escape from prison, with a view of conveying himself with the shipwreck of his fortune to another country, in which he might use it to better advantage. Both suggestions were attended with such doubts and difficulties that he hesitated between them, and for the present laid out £1000 in stock, the interest of which, together with the fruits of his own industry, he hoped would support him above want in his confinement, until something should occur that would point out the expediency of some other determination. Gauntlet still insisted upon having the honour of obtaining his liberty at the expense of taking up his notes to Cunningham, and exhorted him to purchase a commission with part of the money which he had retrieved. The lieutenant affirmed that it was his privilege to procure the release of his cousin Pickle, because he enjoyed a very handsome sum by his aunt, which of right belonged to the young gentleman, to whom he was, moreover, indebted for the use of his furniture, and for the very house that stood over his head; and that although he had already made a will in his favour, he should never be satisfied, nor easy in his mind, so long as he remained deprived of his liberty, and wanted any of the conveniences of life. Cadwallader, who by this time assisted at their councils, and was best acquainted with the peculiarity and unbending disposition of the youth, proposed that, seeing he was so averse to obligations, Mr. Hatchway should purchase of him the garrison with its appendages, which at a moderate price would sell for more money than would be sufficient to discharge his debts; that if the servile subordination of the army did not suit his inclinations, he might, with his reversion, buy a comfortable annuity, and retire with him to the country, where he might live absolutely independent, and entertain himself as usual with the ridiculous characters of mankind. This plan was to Pickle less disagreeable than any other project which as yet had been suggested, and the lieutenant declared himself ready to execute his part of it without delay; but the soldier was mortified at the thoughts of seeing his assistance unnecessary, and eagerly objected to the retirement, as a scheme that would blast the fairest promises of fame and fortune, and bury his youth and talents in solitude and obscurity. This earnest opposition on the part of Gauntlet hindered our adventurer from forming any immediate resolution, which was also retarded by his unwillingness to part with the garrison upon any terms, because he looked upon it as a part of his inheritance, which he could not dispose of without committing an insult upon the memory of the deceased Commodore. Chapter 102. Chapter 103 of the Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 2, by Tobias Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 103. He is engaged in a very extraordinary correspondence, which is interrupted by a very unexpected event. While this affair was in agitation, the captain told him in the course of conversation that Amelia was arrived in town, and had inquired about Mr. Pickle with such an eagerness of concern as seemed to proclaim that she was in some measure informed of his misfortune. He therefore desired to know if he might be allowed to make her acquainted with his situation, provided he should be again importuned by her on that subject which he had at first industriously waived. This proof, or rather presumption, of her sympathizing regard did not fail to operate powerfully upon the bosom of Peregrine, which was immediately filled with those tumults which love, ill stifled, frequently excites. He observed that his disgrace was such as could not be effectually concealed. Therefore he saw no reason for depriving himself of Amelia's compassion, since he was for ever excluded from her affection, and desired Godfrey to present to his sister the lowly respects of a despairing lover. But notwithstanding his declaration of despondence on this head, his imagination involuntarily teemed with more agreeable ideas. The proposal of Crabtree had taken root in his reflection, and he could not help forming plans of pastoral felicity in the arms of the lovely Amelia, remote from those pompous scenes which he now detested and despised. He amused his fancy with the prospect of being able to support her in a state of independency, by means of the slender annuity which it was in his power to purchase, together with the fruits of those endeavours which would profitably employ his vacant hours, and foresaw provision for his growing family in the friendship of the lieutenant, who had already constituted him his heir. He even parcelled out his hours among the necessary cares of the world, the pleasures of domestic bliss, and the enjoyments of a country life, and spent the night in ideal parties with his charming bride, sometimes walking by the sedgy bank of some transparent stream, sometimes pruning the luxuriant vine, and sometimes sitting in social converse with her in a shady grove of his own planting. These, however, were no more than the shadowy phantoms of imagination, which he well knew would never be realized. Not that he believed such happiness unattainable by a person in his circumstances, but because he would not stoop to propose a scheme which might in any shape seem to interfere with the interest of Amelia, or subject himself to a repulse from that young lady who had rejected his addresses in the zenith of his fortune. While he diverted himself with these agreeable reveries, an unexpected event intervened, in which she and her brother were deeply interested. The uncle was tapped for the dropsy, and died in a few days after the operation, having bequeathed in his will £5,000 to his nephew, and twice that sum to his niece, who had always enjoyed the greatest share of his favour. If our adventurer, before this occurrence, looked upon his love for Amelia as a passion which it was necessary at any rate to conquer or suppress, he now considered her accession of fortune as a circumstance which confirmed that necessity, and resolved to discourage every thought on that subject which should tend to the propagation of hope. One day, in the midst of a conversation calculated for the purpose, Godfrey put into his hand a letter directed to Mr. Pickle, in the handwriting of Amelia, which the youth no sooner recognised than his cheeks were covered with the crimson dye, and he began to tremble with violent agitation, for he at once guessed the import of the billet, which he kissed with great reverence and devotion, and was not at all surprised when he read the following words: "Sir, I have performed a sufficient sacrifice to my reputation in retaining hitherto the appearance of that resentment which I had long ago dismissed, and as the late favourable change in my situation empowers me to avow my genuine sentiments without fear of censure or suspicion of mercenary design, I take this opportunity to assure you that if I still maintain that place in your heart which I was vain enough to think I once possessed, I am willing to make the first advances to an accommodation, and have actually furnished my brother with full powers to conclude it in the name of your appeased Amelia." Pickle, having kissed the subscription with great ardour, fell upon his knees, and lifting up his eyes, "Thank Heaven!" cried he, with an air of transport, "I have not been mistaken in my opinion of that generous maid. I believed her inspired with the most dignified and heroic sentiments, and now she gives me a convincing proof of her magnanimity. It is now my business to approve myself worthy of her regard. May Heaven inflict upon me the keenest arrows of its vengeance, if I do not at this instant contemplate the character of Amelia with the most perfect love and adoration. Yet, amiable and enchanting as she is, I am more than ever determined to sacrifice the interest of my passion to my glory, though my life should fail in the contest, and even to refuse an offer which otherwise the whole universe should not bribe me to forego." This declaration was not so unexpected as unwelcome to his friend Gauntlet, who represented that his glory was not at all interested in the affair, because he had already vindicated his generosity in repeated proffers to lay his whole fortune at Amelia's feet, when it was impossible that anything selfish could enter into the proposal, but that in rejecting her present purpose, he would give the world an opportunity to say that his pride was capricious, his obstinacy invincible, and his sister would have undeniable reason to believe that either his passion for her was dissembled, or the ardour of it considerably abated. In answer to these remonstrances, Pickle observed that he had long set the world at defiance, and as to the opinion of Amelia, he did not doubt that she would applaud in her heart the resolution he had taken, and do justice to the purity of his intention. It was not an easy task to divert our hero from his designs at any time of life, but since his confinement his inflexibility was become almost insurmountable. The captain, therefore, after having discharged his conscience in assuring him that his sister's happiness was at stake, that his mother had approved of the step she had taken, and that he himself should be extremely mortified at his refusal, forbore to press him with further argument, which served only to rivet him the more strongly in his own opinion, and undertook to deliver this answer to Amelia's letter: "Madam, that I revere the dignity of your virtue with the utmost veneration, and love you infinitely more than life, I am at all times ready to demonstrate. But the sacrifice to honour it is now my turn to pay, and such is the rigour of my destiny, that in order to justify your generosity, I must refuse to profit by your condescension. Madam, I am doomed to be for ever wretched, and to sigh without ceasing for the possession of that jewel, which, though now in my offer, I dare not enjoy. I shall not pretend to express the anguish that tears my heart, whilst I communicate this fatal renunciation, but appeal to the delicacy of your own sentiments, which can judge of my sufferings, and will doubtless do justice to the self-denial of your forlorn P. Pickle." Amelia, who knew the nicety of our hero's pride, had foreseen the purport of this epistle before it came to her hands. She did not therefore despair of success, nor desist from the prosecution of her plan, which was no other than that of securing her own happiness in espousing the man upon whom she had fixed her unalterable affection. Confident of his honour, and fully satisfied of the mutual passion with which they were inspired, she gradually decoyed him into a literary correspondence, wherein she attempted to refute the arguments on which he grounded his refusal, And, without doubt, the young gentleman was not a little pleased with the enjoyment of such delightful commerce, in the course of which he had more than ever an opportunity of admiring the poignancy of her wit and the elegance of her understanding. The contemplation of such excellency, while it strengthened the chains with which she held him enslaved, added emulation to the other motives that induced him to maintain the dispute; and much subtlety of reasoning was expended upon both sides of this very particular question, without any prospect of conviction on either part, till at last she began to despair of making him a proselyte to her opinion by dint of argument, and resolved for the future to apply herself chiefly to the irresistible prepossessions of his love, which were not at all diminished or impaired by the essays of her pen. With this view she proposed a conference, pretending that it was impossible to convey all her reflections upon this subject in a series of short letters, and Godfrey undertook to bail him for the day. But, conscious of her power, he would not trust himself in her presence, though his heart throbbed with all the eagerness of desire to see her fair eyes disrobed of that resentment which they had worn so long, and to enjoy the ravishing sweets of a fond reconciliation. Nature could not have held out against such powerful attacks, had not the pride and caprice of his disposition been gratified to the full in the triumph of his resistance. He looked upon the contest as altogether original, and persevered with obstinacy because he thought himself sure of favourable terms whenever he should be disposed to capitulate. Perhaps he might have overshot himself in the course of his perseverance. A young lady of Amelia's fortune and attractions could not fail to find herself surrounded by temptations which few women can resist. She might have misinterpreted the meaning of some paragraph, or taken umbrage at an unguarded expression in one of Peregrine's letters. She might have been tired out by his obstinate peculiarity, or at the long run construed it into madness, slight, or indifference. Or rather than waste her prime in fruitless endeavours to subdue the pride of a headstrong humourist, she might have listened to the voice of some admirer, fraught with qualifications sufficient to engage her esteem and affection. But all these possibilities were providentially prevented by an accident, attended with more important consequences than any we have hitherto recounted. Early one morning Pipes was disturbed by the arrival of a messenger, who had been sent express from the country by Mr. Clover, with a packet for the lieutenant, and arrived in town overnight. But as he was obliged to have recourse to the information of Jack's correspondent in the city touching the place of his abode, before he demanded entrance at the Fleet, the gate was shut. Nor would the turnkeys admit him, although he told them that he was charged with a message of the utmost consequence, so that he was fain to tarry till daybreak, when he, at his earnest solicitation, was allowed to enter. Hatchway, opening the packet, found a letter enclosed for Peregrine, with an earnest request that he should forward it to the hands of that young gentleman with all possible dispatch. Jack, who could not dive into the meaning of this extraordinary injunction, began to imagine that Mrs. Clover lay at the point of death, and wanted to take a last farewell of her brother. And this conceit worked so strongly upon his imagination, that while he huddled on his clothes, and made the best of his way to the apartment of our hero, he could not help cursing within himself the folly of the husband in sending such disagreeable messages to a man of Peregrine's impatient temper, already soured by his own uneasy situation. This reflection would have induced him to suppress the letter, had not he been afraid to tamper with the ticklish disposition of his friend, to whom, while he delivered it, "As for my own part," said he, "mayhap I may have as much natural affection as another; but when my spouse parted, I bore my misfortune like a British man and a Christian. For why? He's no better than a freshwater sailor, who knows not how to stem the current of mischance." Pickle, being waked from a pleasant dream, in which the fair Amelia was principally concerned, and hearing this strange preamble, sat up in his bed, and unsealed the letter in a state of mortification and disgust. But what were the emotions of his soul when he read the following intimation: "Dear brother, it hath pleased God to take your father suddenly off by a fit of apoplexy, and as he has died intestate, I give you this notice that you may with all speed come down and take possession of your right, in despite of Master Gam and his mother, who you may be sure do not sit easy under this unexpected dispensation of Providence. I have, by virtue of being a justice of the peace, taken such precautions as I thought necessary for your advantage, and the funeral shall be deferred until your pleasure be known. Your sister, though sincerely afflicted by her father's fate, submits to the will of Heaven with laudable resignation, and begs you will set out for this place without delay, in which request she is joined by, Sir, your affectionate brother and humble servant, Charles Clover." Peregrine at first looked upon this epistle as a mere illusion of the brain, and continuation of the reverie in which he had been engaged. He read it 10 times over without being persuaded that he was actually awake. He rubbed his eyes and shook his head in order to shake off the drowsy vapours that surrounded him. He hemmed thrice with great vociferation, snapped his fingers, tweaked his nose, started up from his bed, and opening the casement, took a survey of the well-known objects that appeared on each side of his habitation. Everything seemed congruous and connected, and he said within himself, "Sure, this is the most distinct dream that ever sleep produced." Then he had recourse again to the paper, which he carefully perused, without finding any variation from his first notion of the contents. Hatchway, seeing all his extravagances of action, accompanied with a wild stare of distraction, began to believe that his head was at length fairly turned, and was really meditating means for securing his person, when Pickle, in a tone of surprise, exclaimed, "Good God! Am I or am I not awake?" "Why, look ye, cousin Pickle," replied the lieutenant, "that is a question which the deep sea line of my understanding is not long enough to sound. But howsomever, doff I can't trust to the observation I have taken. It shall go hard but I will fall upon a way to guess whereabouts we are." So saying, he lifted up a pitcher full of cold water that stood behind the outward door, and discharged it in the face of Peregrine without ceremony or hesitation. This remedy produced the desired effect. Unpalatable as it was, the young gentleman no sooner recovered his breath, which was endangered by such a sudden application, than he thanked his friend Jack for the seasonable operation he had performed. Having no longer any just reason to doubt the reality of what appeared so convincingly to his senses, he shifted himself on the instant, not without hurry and trepidation, and putting on his morning dress, sallied forth to the Bear, in order to deliberate with himself on the important intelligence he had received. Hatchway, not yet fully convinced of his sanity, and curious to know the purport of the letter, which had affected him in such an extraordinary manner, carefully attended his footsteps in this excursion, in hope of being favoured with his confidence in the course of their perambulation. Our hero no sooner appeared at the street door, than he was saluted by the messenger, who, having posted himself in the way for that purpose, "God bless your noble honour, Squire Pickle," cried he, "and give you joy of succeeding to your father's estate." These words had scarce proceeded from his mouth, when the lieutenant, hopping eagerly towards the countryman, squeezed his hand with great affection, and asked if the old gentleman had actually taken his departure. "Ay, Master Hatchway," replied the other, "in such a woundy haste, that he forgot to make a will." "Body of me!" exclaimed the seaman, "these are the best tidings I have ever heard since I first went to sea. Here, my lad, take my purse, and stow thyself chuck full of the best liquor in the land." So saying, he tipped the peasant with 10 pieces, and immediately the whole place echoed the sound of Tom's instrument. Peregrine, repairing to the Walk, communicated the billet to his honest friend, who at his desire went forthwith to the lodgings of Captain Gauntlet, and returned in less than an hour with that gentleman, who, I need not say, was heartily rejoiced at the occasion. End of chapter 103. Chapter 104 of the Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 2, by Tobias Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 104. Peregrine holds a consultation with his friends, in consequence of which he bids adieu to the fleet. He arrives at his father's house and asserts his right of inheritance. Nor did our hero keep the misanthrope in ignorance of this happy turn of fortune. Pipes was dispatched to the senior with a message requesting his immediate presence, and he accordingly appeared in obedience to the summons, growling with discontent for having been deprived of several hours of his natural rest. His mouth was immediately stopped with the letter, at which he smiled horribly a ghastly grin, and after a compliment of gratulations, they entered into close divan about the measures to be taken in consequence of this event. There was no room for much debate. It was unanimously agreed that Pickle should set out with all possible dispatch for the garrison, to which Gauntlet and Hatchway resolved to attend him. Pipes was accordingly ordered to prepare a couple of post-chaises, while Godfrey went to procure bail for his friend, and provide them with money for the expense of the expedition, but not before he was desired by Peregrine to conceal this piece of news from his sister, that our youth might have an opportunity to surprise her in a more interesting manner, after he should have settled his affairs. All these previous steps being taken, in less than an hour our hero took his leave of the fleet, after he had left 20 guineas with the warden for the relief of the poor prisoners, a great number of whom conveyed him to the gate, pouring forth prayers for his long life and prosperity. And he took the road to the garrison in the most elevated transports of joy, unallayed with the least mixture of grief at the death of a parent, whose paternal tenderness he had never known. His breast was absolutely a stranger to that boasted storm, or instinct of affection, by which the charities are supposed to subsist. Of all the journeys he had ever made, this, sure, was the most delightful. He felt all the ecstasy that must naturally be produced in a young man of his imagination from such a sudden transition in point of circumstance. He found himself delivered from confinement and disgrace, without being obliged to any person upon earth for his deliverance. He had it now in his power to retort the contempt of the world in a manner suited to his most sanguine wish. He was reconciled to his friend, and enabled to gratify his love, even upon his own terms, and saw himself in possession of a fortune more ample than his first inheritance, with a stock of experience that would steer him clear of all those quicksands among which he had been formerly wrecked. In the middle of their journey, while they halted at an inn for a short refreshment and change of horses, a postillion, running up to Peregrine in the yard, fell at his feet, clasped his knees with great eagerness and agitation, and presented to him the individual face of his old valet de chambre. The youth, perceiving him in such an abject garb and attitude, commanded him to rise and tell the cause of such a miserable reverse in his fortune, upon which Hadji gave him to understand that he had been ruined by his wife, who, having robbed him of all his cash and valuable effects, had eloped from his house with one of his own customers, who appeared in the character of a French count, but was in reality no other than an Italian fiddler; that in consequence of this retreat he, the husband, was disabled from paying a considerable sum which he had set apart for his wine merchant, who, being disappointed in his expectation, took out an execution against his effects; and the rest of his creditors, following his example, hunted him out of house and home; so that, finding his person in danger at London, he had been obliged to escape into the country, skulking about from one village to another, till, being quite destitute of all support, he had undertaken his present office to save himself from starving. Peregrine listened with compassion to his lamentable tale, which too well accounted for his not appearing in the fleet, with offers of service to his master in distress, a circumstance that Pickle had all along imputed to his avarice and ingratitude. He assured him that, as he had been the means of throwing in his way the temptation to which he fell a sacrifice, he would charge himself with the retrieval of his affairs. In the meantime he made him taste of his bounty, and desired him to continue in his present employment until he should return from the garrison, when he would consider his situation and do something for his immediate relief. Hadji attempted to kiss his shoe, and wept, or affected to weep, with sensibility at his gracious reception. He even made a merit of his unwillingness to exercise his new occupation, and earnestly begged that he might be allowed to give immediate attendance upon his dear master, from whom he could not bear the thoughts of a second parting. His entreaties were reinforced by the intercession of his two friends, in consequence of which the Swiss was permitted to follow them at his own leisure, while they set forward after a slight repast, and reached the place of their destination before 10 o'clock at night. Peregrine, instead of alighting at the garrison, rode straightway to his father's house, and no person appearing to receive him, not even a servant to take care of his chaise, he dismounted without assistance. Being followed by his two friends, he advanced into the hall, where, perceiving a bell rope, he made immediate application to it in such a manner as brought a couple of footmen into his presence. After having reprimanded them with a stern look for their neglect in point of attendance, he commanded them to show him into an apartment, and as they seemed unwilling to yield obedience to his orders, asked if they did not belong to the family. One of them, who took upon himself the office of spokesman, replied with a sullen air that they had been in the service of old Mr. Pickle, and now that he was dead, thought themselves bound to obey nobody but their lady and her son, Mr. Gamaliel. This declaration had scarce proceeded from his mouth, when our hero gave them to understand that, since they were not disposed to own any other master, they must change their quarters immediately. He ordered them to decamp without further preparation, and as they still continued rested, they were kicked out of doors by the captain and his friend Hatchway. Squire Gam, who overheard everything that passed, and was now more than ever inflamed with that rancour which he had sucked with his mother's milk, flew to the assistance of his adherents, with a pistol in each hand, bellowing, "Thieves! Thieves!" with great vociferation, as if he had mistaken the business of the strangers, and actually believed himself in danger of being robbed. Under this pretence he discharged a piece at his brother, who luckily escaped the shot, closed with him in a moment, and wresting the other pistol from his grip, turned him out into the courtyard, to the consolation of his two dependents. By this time Pipes and the two postillions had taken possession of the stables, without being opposed by the coachman and his deputy, who quietly submitted to the authority of their new sovereign. But the noise of the pistol had alarmed Mrs. Pickle, who, running downstairs with the most frantic appearance, attended by two maids and the curate, who still maintained his place of chaplain and ghostly director in the family, would have assaulted our hero with her nails, had not she been restrained by her attendants. Though they prevented her from using her hands, they could not hinder her from exercising her tongue, which she wagged against him with all the virulence of malice. She asked if he were come to butcher his brother, to insult his father's corpse, and triumph in her affliction. She bestowed upon him the epithets of spendthrift, jailbird, and unnatural ruffian. She begged pardon of God for having brought such a monster into the world, accused him of having brought his father's grey hairs with sorrow to the grave, and affirmed that were he to touch the body, it would bleed at his approach. Without pretending to refute the articles of this ridiculous charge, he allowed her to ring out her alarm, and then calmly replied that if she did not quietly retire to her chamber, and behave as became a person in her present situation, he should insist upon her removing to another lodging without delay, for he was determined to be master in his own family. The lady, who in all probability expected that he would endeavour to appease her with all the tenderness of filial submission, was so much exasperated at his cavalier behaviour that her constitution could not support the transports of her spirits, and she was carried off by her women in a fit, while the officious clergyman was dismissed after his pupil with all the circumstances of disgrace. Our hero, having thus made his quarters good, took possession of the best apartment in the house, and sent notice of his arrival to Mr. Clover, who, with his wife, visited him in less than an hour, and was not a little surprised to find him so suddenly settled in his father's house. The meeting of Julia and her brother was extremely pathetic. She had always loved him with uncommon tenderness, and looked upon him as the ornament of her family, but she had heard of his extravagances with regret, and though she considered the stories that were circulated at his expense as the malicious exaggerations of his mother and her darling son, her apprehension had been grievously alarmed by an account of his imprisonment and distress, which had been accidentally conveyed to that country by a gentleman from London, who had been formerly of his acquaintance. She could not, therefore, without the most tender emotions of joy, see him, as it were, restored to his rightful inheritance, and re-established in that station of life which she thought he could fill with dignity and importance. After their mutual expressions of affection, she retired to her mother's chamber, with a view to make a second offer of her service and attendance, which had been already rejected with scorn since her father's death, while Peregrine consulted his brother-in-law about the affairs of the family, so far as they had fallen within his cognizance and observation. Mr. Clover told him that, though he was never favoured with the confidence of the defunct, he knew some of his intimates who had been tampered with by Mrs. Pickle, and even engaged to second the remonstrances by which she had often endeavoured to persuade her husband to settle his affairs by a formal will, but that he had from time to time evaded their importunities with surprising excuses of procrastination that plainly appeared to be the result of invention and design far above the supposed pitch of his capacity, a circumstance from which Mr. Clover concluded that the old gentleman imagined his life would not have been secure had he once taken such a step as would have rendered it unnecessary to the independence of his second son. He moreover observed that in consequence of this information he no sooner heard of Mr. Pickle's death, which happened at the club, than he went directly with a lawyer to his house before any cabal or conspiracy could be formed against the rightful heir, and in presence of witnesses provided for the purpose, sealed up all the papers of the deceased, after the widow had, in the first transports of her sorrow and vexation, fairly owned that her husband had died intestate. Peregrine was extremely well satisfied with this intelligence, by which all his doubts were dispelled, and having cheerfully supped with his friends on a cold collation, which his brother-in-law had brought in his chariot, they retired to rest in different chambers, after Julia had met with another repulse from her capricious mother, whose overflowing rage had now subsided into the former channel of calm inveteracy. Next morning the house was supplied with some servants from the garrison, and preparations were made for the funeral of the deceased. Gam, having taken lodgings in the neighbourhood, came with a chaise and cart to demand his mother, together with his own clothes and her personal effects. Our hero, though he would not suffer him to enter the door, allowed his proposal to be communicated to the widow, who eagerly embraced the opportunity of removing, and was, with her own baggage and that of her beloved son, conveyed to the place which he had prepared for her reception. Thither she was followed by her woman, who was desired by Peregrine to assure her mistress that until a regular provision could be settled upon her, she might command him in point of money or any other accommodation in his power. End of chapter 104. Chapter 105 of The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 2, by Tobias Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 105. He performs the last offices to his father, and returns to London upon a very interesting design. Suits of mourning being provided for himself, his friends, and adherents, and every other previous measure taken suitable to the occasion, his father was interred in a private manner in the parish church, and his papers being examined, in presence of many persons of honour and integrity, invited for that purpose, no will was found, or any other deed,
in favour of the second son, though it appeared by the marriage settlement that the widow was entitled to a jointure of £500 a year. The rest of his papers consisted of East India bonds, South Sea annuities, mortgages, notes, and assignments, to the amount of £64,760, exclusive of the house, plate, and furniture, horses, equipage, and cattle, with the garden and park adjacent to a very considerable extent. This was a sum that even exceeded his expectation, and could not fail to entertain his fancy with the most agreeable ideas. He found himself immediately a man of vast consequence among his country neighbours, who visited him with compliments of congratulation, and treated him with such respect as would have effectually spoiled any young man of his disposition, who had not the same advantages of experience as he had already purchased at a very extravagant price. Thus, shielded with caution, he bore his prosperity with surprising temperance. Everybody was charmed with his affability and moderation. When he made a circuit round the gentlemen of the district, in order to repay the courtesy which he owed, he was caressed by them with uncommon assiduity, and advised to offer himself as a candidate for the county at the next election, which they supposed would soon happen, because the present member was in a declining state of health. Nor did his person and address escape unheeded by the ladies, many of whom did not scruple to spread their attractions before him, with a view of captivating such a valuable prize. Nay, such an impression did this legacy make upon a certain peer, who resided in this part of the country, that he cultivated Pickle's acquaintance with great eagerness, and without circumlocution offered to him in marriage his only daughter, with a very considerable fortune. Our hero expressed himself upon this occasion as became a man of honour, sensibility, and politeness, and frankly gave his lordship to understand that his heart was already engaged. He was pleased with the opportunity of making such a sacrifice of his passion for Emilia, which by this time inflamed his thoughts to such a degree of impatience, that he resolved to depart for London with all possible speed, and for that purpose industriously employed almost every hour of his time in regulating his domestic affairs. He paid off all his father's servants, and hired others, at the recommendation of his sister, who promised to superintend his household in his absence. He advanced the first half-yearly payment of his mother's jointure, and as for his brother Gam, he gave him divers opportunities of acknowledging his fault, so that he might have answered to his own conscience for taking any step in his favour. But that young gentleman was not yet sufficiently humbled by misfortune, and not only forbore to make any overtures of peace, but also took all occasions to slander the conduct and revile the person of our hero, being in this practice comforted and abetted by his righteous mamma. Everything being thus settled for the present, the triumvirate set out on their return to town in the same manner with that in which they had arrived in the country, except in this small variation, that Hatchway's chaise companion was now the valet de chambre, refitted instead of Pipes, who with another lackey attended them on horseback. When they had performed 2/3 of their way to London, they chanced to overtake a country squire on his return from a visit to one of his neighbours, who had entertained him with such hospitality that, as the lieutenant observed, he rolled himself almost gunwale to every motion of his horse, which was a fine hunter, and when the chaise passed him at full speed, he set up the sportsman halloo in a voice that sounded like a French horn, clapping spurs to sorrel at the same time, in order to keep up with the pace of the machine. Peregrine, who was animated with an uncommon flow of spirits, ordered his postillion to proceed more softly, and entered into conversation with the stranger touching the make and mettle of his horse, upon which he descanted with so much learning that the squire was astonished at his knowledge. When they approached his habitation, he invited the young gentleman and his company to halt and drink a bottle of his ale, and was so pressing in his solicitation that they complied with his request. He accordingly conducted them through a spacious avenue that extended as far as the highway to the gate of a large chateau of a most noble and venerable appearance, which induced them to alight and view the apartments, contrary to their first intention of drinking a glass of his October at the door. The rooms were every way suitable to the magnificence of the outside, and our hero imagined they had made a tour through the whole sweep, when the landlord gave him to understand that they had not yet seen the best apartment of the house, and immediately led them into a spacious dining room, which Peregrine did not enter without giving manifest signs of uncommon astonishment. The panels all round were covered with portraits at full length by Vandyck, and not one of them appeared without a ridiculous tie periwig, in the style of those that usually hang over the shops of twopenny barbers. The straight boots in which the figures had been originally painted, and the other circumstances of attitude and drapery, so inconsistent with this monstrous furniture of the head, exhibited such a ludicrous appearance that Pickle's wonder in a little time gave way to his mirth, and he was seized with a violent fit of laughter, which had well nigh deprived him of his breath. The squire, half pleased and half offended at this expression of ridicule. "I know," said he, "what makes you laugh so woefully. You think it strange to zee my vorefathers booted and spurred, with huge 3-tailed periwigs on their pates. The truth of the matter is this: I could not abide to zee the pictures of my vamily with a parcel of loose hair hanging about their eyes, like zo many colts, and zo I employed a painter vello from London to clap decent periwigs upon their skulls, at the rate of 5 shillings a head, and offer him 3 shillings apiece to furnish each with a handsome pair of shoes and stockings. But the rascal, thinking I must have 'em done at any price after their heads were covered, haggled with me for 4 shillings a picture, and zo rather than be imposed upon, I turned him off, and shall let 'em stand as they are till zome more reasonable brother of the brush comes round the country." Pickle commended his resolution, though in his heart he blessed himself from such a barbarous Goth, and after they had dispatched 2 or 3 bottles of his beer, they proceeded on their journey, and arrived in town about 11 at night. End of chapter 105. Chapter 106 of the Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 2, by Tobias Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 106. He enjoys an interview with Amelia, and makes himself ample amends for all the mortifications of his life. Godfrey, who had taken leave of his sister on pretence of making a short excursion with Peregrine, whose health required the enjoyment of fresh air after his long confinement, sent a message to her that same night, announcing his arrival, and giving her notice that he would breakfast with her next morning. When he and our hero, who had dressed himself for the purpose, taking a hackney coach, repaired to her lodging, and were introduced into a parlour adjoining to that in which the tea table was set. Here they had not waited many minutes when they heard the sound of feet coming downstairs, upon which our hero's heart began to beat the alarm. He concealed himself behind the screen by the direction of his friend, whose ears being saluted with Sophy's voice from the next room, he flew into it with great ardour, and enjoyed upon her lips the sweet transports of a meeting so unexpected, for he had left her in her father's house at Windsor. Amidst these emotions he had almost forgotten the situation of Peregrine, when Amelia, assuming her enchanting air, "Is not this," said she, "a most provoking scene to a young woman like me, who am doomed to wear the willow by the strange caprice of my lover? Upon my word, brother, you have done me infinite prejudice in promoting this jaunt with my obstinate correspondent, who I suppose is so ravished with this transient glimpse of liberty, that he will never be persuaded to incur unnecessary confinement for the future." "My dear sister," replied the captain tauntingly, "your own pride set him the example, so you must e'en stand to the consequence of his imitation." "'Tis a hard case, however," answered the fair offender, "that I should suffer all my life by one venial trespass. Heigh ho! Who would imagine that a sprightly girl such as I, with 10,000 pounds, should go a begging? I have a good mind to marry the next person that asks me the question, in order to be revenged upon this unyielding humorist." Did the dear fellow discover no inclination to see me, in all the term of his releasement? Well, if ever I can catch the fugitive again, he shall sing in his cage for life. It is impossible to convey to the reader a just idea of Peregrine's transports while he overheard this declaration, which was no sooner pronounced than, unable to resist the impetuosity of his passion, He sprung from his lurking place, exclaiming, "Here I surrender!" and rushing into her presence, was so dazzled with her beauty that his speech failed. He was fixed like a statue to the floor, and all his faculties were absorbed in admiration. Indeed, she was now in the full bloom of her charms, and it was nearly impossible to look upon her without emotion. What then must have been the ecstasy of our youth, whose passion was wedded with all the incitements which could stimulate the human heart? The ladies screamed with surprise at his appearance, and Amelia underwent such agitation as flushed every charm with irresistible energy. Her cheeks glowed with a most delicate suffusion, and her bosom heaved with such bewitching undulation, that the cambric could not conceal or contain the snowy hemispheres that rose like a vision of paradise to his view. While he was almost fainting with unutterable delight, she seemed to sink under the tumults of tenderness and confusion, when our hero, perceiving her condition, obeyed the impulse of his love, and circled the charmer in his arms without suffering the least frown or symptom of displeasure. Not all the pleasures of his life had amounted to the ineffable joy of this embrace, in which he continued for some minutes totally entranced. He fastened upon her pouting lips with all the eagerness of rapture, and while his brain seemed to whirl round with transport, exclaimed in a delirium of bliss, "Heaven and earth! This is too much to bear!" His imagination was accordingly relieved, and his attention in some measure divided, by the interposition of Sophy, who kindly chid him for his having overlooked his old friends. Thus accosted, he quitted his delicious armful, and saluting Mrs. Gauntlet, asked pardon for his neglect, observing that such rudeness was excusable, considering the long and unhappy exile which he had suffered from the jewel of his soul. Then turning to Amelia, "I am come, madam," said he, "to claim the performance of your promise, which I can produce under your own fair hand. You may therefore lay aside all superfluous ceremony and shyness, and crown my happiness without further delay. For upon my soul, my thoughts are wound up to the last pitch of expectation, and I shall certainly run distracted if I am doomed to any term of probation." His mistress, having by this time recollected herself, replied with a most exhilarating smile, "I ought to punish you for your obstinacy with the mortification of a 12 months' trial; but it is dangerous to tamper with an admirer of your disposition, and therefore I think I must make sure of you while it is in my power. You are willing, then, to take me for better, for worse, in presence of Heaven and these witnesses?" cried Peregrine, kneeling, and applying her hand to his lips. At this interrogation her features softened into an amazing expression of condescending love, and while she darted a side glance that thrilled to his marrow, and heaved a sigh more soft than Zephyr's balmy wing, her answer was, "Why, I, and Heaven grant me patience to bear the humours of such a yoke fellow." "And may the same powers," replied the youth, "grant me life and opportunity to manifest the immensity of my love. Meanwhile I have £80,000, which shall be laid immediately in your lap." So saying, he sealed the contract upon her lips, and explained the mystery of his last words, which had begun to operate upon the wonder of the two sisters. Sophy was agreeably surprised with the account of his good fortune, nor was it in all probability unacceptable to the lovely Amelia; though from this information she took an opportunity to upbraid her admirer with the inflexibility of his pride, which, she scrupled not to say, would have baffled all the suggestions of his passion, had it not been gratified by this providential event. Matters being thus happily matured, the lover begged that immediate recourse might be had to the church, and his happiness ascertained before night. But the bride objected with great vehemence to such precipitation, being desirous of her mother's presence at the ceremony, and she was seconded in her opinion by her brother's wife. Peregrine, maddening with desire, assaulted her with the most earnest entreaties, representing that, as her mother's consent was already obtained, there was surely no necessity for delay, that must infallibly make a dangerous impression upon his brain and constitution. He fell at her feet in all the agony of impatience, and swore his life and intellects would actually be in jeopardy by her refusal; and when she attempted to argue him out of his demand, began to rage with such extravagance, that Sophy was frightened into conviction, and Godfrey, enforcing the remonstrances of his friend, the amiable Amelia was teased into compliance. After breakfast the bridegroom and his companions set out for the commons for a licence, having first agreed upon the house at which the ceremony should be performed, in the lodgings of the bride; and the permission being obtained, they found means to engage a clergyman, who undertook to attend them at their own time and place. Then a ring was purchased for the occasion, and they went in search of the lieutenant, with whom they dined at a tavern, and not only made him acquainted with the steps they had taken, but desired that he would stand godfather to the bride, an employment which Jack accepted with demonstrations of particular satisfaction, till chancing to look into the street, and seeing Cadwallader approach the door, in consequence of a message they had sent to him by pipes, he declined the office in favour of the senior, who was accordingly ordained for that purpose, on the supposition that such a mark of regard might facilitate his concurrence with a match which otherwise he would certainly oppose, as he was a professed enemy to wedlock, and as yet ignorant of Peregrine's intention. After having congratulated Pickle upon his succession, and shook his two friends by the hand, the misanthrope asked whose mare was dead, that he was summoned in such a plaguy hurry from his dinner, which he had been fain to gobble up like a cannibal. Our hero gave him to understand that they had made an appointment to drink tea with two agreeable ladies, and were unwilling that he should lose the opportunity of enjoying an entertainment which he loved so much. Crabtree, shrivelling up his face like an autumn leaf at this intimation, cursed his complaisance, and swore they should keep their assignation without him, for he and lechery had shaken hands many years ago. The bridegroom, however, likening him unto an old coachman, who still delights in the smack of the whip, and dropping some flattering hints of his manhood, even at these years, he was gradually prevailed upon to accompany them to the place of rendezvous, where, being ushered into a dining room, they had not waited 3 minutes, when they were joined by the parson, who had observed the hour with great punctuality. This gentleman no sooner entered the room than Cadwallader, in a whisper to Gauntlet, asked if that was not the cock bawd, and before the captain could make any reply, "What an unconscionable whoremaster the rogue is," said he, "scarce discharged from confinement, and sweetened with a little fresh air, when he wenches with a pimp and canonicals in his pay." The door again opened, and Amelia broke in upon them with such dignity of mien and divinity of aspect, as inspired every spectator with astonishment and admiration. The lieutenant, who had not seen her since her charms were ripened into such perfection, expressed his wonder and approbation in an exclamation of "Adzooks, what a glorious galley!" and the misanthrope's visage was instantly metamorphosed into the face of a mountain goat. He licked his lips instinctively, snuffed the air, and squinted with the most horrible obliquity of vision. The bride and her sister being seated, and Hatchway having renewed his acquaintance with the former, who recognized him with particular civility, Peregrine withdrew into another apartment with his friend Crabtree, to whom he imparted the design of his meeting, which the latter no sooner understood than he attempted to retreat, without making any other reply than that of "Pshaw! Rot your matrimony! Can't you put your neck in the noose without my being a witness of your folly?" The young gentleman, in order to vanquish this aversion, stepped to the door of the next room, and begged the favour of speaking with Amelia, to whom he introduced the testy old bachelor as one of his particular friends, who desired to have the honour of giving her away. The bewitching smile with which she received his salute and granted his request, at once overcame the disapprobation of the misanthrope, who, with a relaxation in his countenance, which had never been perceived before that instant, thanked her in the most polite terms for such an agreeable mark of distinction. He accordingly led her to the dining room, where the ceremony was performed without delay, and after the husband had asserted his prerogative on her lips, the whole company saluted her by the name of Mrs. Pickle. I shall leave the sensible reader to judge what passed at this juncture within the bosoms of the new married couple. Peregrine's heart was fired with inexpressible ardour and impatience, while the transports of the bride were mingled with a dash of diffidence and apprehension. Gauntlet saw it would be too much for both to bear their present tantalizing situation till night, without some amusement to divert their thoughts, and therefore proposed to pass part of the evening at the public entertainments in Marylebone Gardens, which were at that time frequented by the best company in town. The scheme was relished by the discreet Sophy, who saw the meaning of the proposal, and the bride submitted to the persuasion of her sister, so that after tea 2 coaches were called, and Peregrine was forcibly separated from his charmer during the conveyance. The new married couple and their company having made shift to spend the evening, and supped on a slight collation in one of the boxes, Peregrine's patience was almost quite exhausted, and taking Godfrey aside, he imparted his intention to withdraw in private from the sea-wit of his friend Hatchway, who would otherwise retard his bliss with unseasonable impediments, which at present he could not possibly bear. Gauntlet, who sympathized with his impatience, undertook to intoxicate the lieutenant with bumpers to the joy of the bride, and in the meantime desired Sophy to retire with his sister under the auspices of Cadwallader, who promised to squire them home. The ladies were accordingly conducted to the coach, and Jack proposed to the captain that for the sake of the joke the bridegroom should be plied with liquor in such a manner as would effectually disable him from enjoying the fruits of his good fortune for one night at least. Gauntlet seemed to relish the scheme, and they prevailed upon Pickle to accompany them to a certain tavern, on pretence of drinking a farewell glass to a single life. There the bottle was circulated, till Hatchway's brain began to suffer innovation. As he had secured our hero's hat and sword, he felt no apprehension of an elopement, which, however, was effected, and the youth hastened on the wings of love to the arms of his enchanting bride. He found Crabtree in a parlour, waiting for his return, and disposed to entertain him with a lecture upon temperance, to which he paid very little attention, but ringing for Amelia's maid, desired to know if her mistress was in bed. Being answered in the affirmative, he sent her upstairs to announce his arrival, undressed himself to a loose gown and slippers, and wishing the misanthrope good night, after having desired to see him next day, followed in person to the delicious scene where he found her elegantly dished out, the fairest daughter of chastity and love. When he approached, she was overwhelmed with confusion, and hid her lovely face from his transporting view. Mrs. Gauntlet, seeing his eyes kindled at the occasion, kissed her charming sister, who, throwing her snowy arms about her neck, would have detained her in the room, had not Peregrine gently disengaged her confidante from her embrace, and conducted her trembling to the door, which having bolted and barricadoed, he profited by his good fortune, and his felicity was perfect. Next day he rose about noon, and found his three friends assembled, when he learned that Jack had fallen in his own snare, and been obliged to lie in the same tavern where he fell, a circumstance of which he was so much ashamed, that Peregrine and his wife escaped many jokes, which he would have certainly cracked, had he not lain under the imputation of this disgrace. In half an hour after he came down, Mrs. Pickle appeared with Sophy, blushing like Aurora, or the goddess of health, and sending forth emanations of beauty unparalleled. She was complimented upon her change of situation by all present, and by none more warmly than by old Crabtree, who declared himself so well satisfied with his friend's fortune as to be almost reconciled to that institution against which he had declaimed during the best part of his life. An express was immediately dispatched to Mrs. Gauntlet with an account of her daughter's marriage. A town house was hired, and a handsome equipage set up, in which the new married pair appeared at all public places, to the astonishment of our adventurer's fair weather friends, and the admiration of all the world; for in point of figure, such another couple was not to be found in the whole United Kingdom. Envy despaired, and detraction was struck dumb, when our hero's new accession of fortune was consigned to the celebration of public fame. Emilia attracted the notice of all observers, from the pert Templar to the sovereign himself, who was pleased to bestow encomiums upon the excellence of her beauty. Many persons of consequence, who had dropped the acquaintance of Peregrine in the beginning of his decline, now made open efforts to cultivate his friendship anew, but he discouraged all these advances with the most mortifying disdain; and one day, when the nobleman whom he had formerly obliged came up to him in the drawing room with the salutation of "Your servant, Mr. Pickle," he eyed him with a look of ineffable contempt, saying, "I suppose your lordship is mistaken in your man," and turned his head another way in presence of the whole court. When he made a circuit round all the places frequented by the beau monde, to the utter confusion of those against whom his resentment was kindled, paid off his debts, and settled his money matters in town, Hatchway was dismissed to the country, in order to prepare for the reception of his fair Emilia. In a few days after his departure, the whole company, Cadwallader himself included, set out for his father's house, and in their way took up Mrs. Gauntlet, the mother, who was sincerely rejoiced to see our hero in the capacity of her son-in-law. From her habitation they proceeded homewards at an easy pace, and amidst the acclamations of the whole parish, entered their own house, where Amelia was received in the most tender manner by Mr. Chlover's wife, who had provided everything for her ease and accommodation, and next day surrendered unto her the management of her own household affairs. End of Section 106. End of The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 2, by Tobias Smollett.